The night air over the Nile was still warm, even after the sun had disappeared behind the distant western hills. A soft wind moved slowly across the dark water. Reeds along the riverbank bent gently and then became still again. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once before the sound faded into the heavy silence of the sleeping city. Small oil lamps glowed behind open windows made from wood and woven reeds. Their dim yellow light rested softly against mud brick walls that still carried the heat of the day. Above the narrow streets, the stars stretched quietly across the black Egyptian sky. And in many homes, children were still awake. Some sat beside low tables while older brothers copied symbols onto pieces of broken pottery. Some carried water jars through dusty courtyards. Some rested silently near bread ovens where the smell of grain and smoke drifted slowly into the night air. Others were already asleep on woven mats laid across cool stone floors. Their small hands were rough from work. Their feet carried dust from roads baked hard under the sun. And though they were children, many of them already understood exhaustion. In the ancient world, childhood was not always a time of play. For many families living beside the Nile River, childhood slowly became something else. A preparation. A training. A test of endurance beneath the heat of endless days. The river itself moved quietly through the darkness, as it always had. The Nile carried life into Egypt. It carried water, fish, mud for farming, and narrow boats loaded with grain and stone. It fed cities and villages stretched along its banks. Without it, the desert would have swallowed everything beneath endless sand and burning wind. Each morning before sunrise, workers stepped into fields softened by river water. Farmers bent low over wet earth while birds circled overhead in the pale morning sky. Men carried tools made from wood and copper. Women ground grain into flour using heavy stones worn smooth by years of labor. Children watched all of this from the moment they could walk. And slowly, they joined the work. At first, their tasks were small. A little boy might chase birds away from newly planted fields while the morning air was still cool. A young girl might carry bundles of reeds beside her mother or knead dough beside the oven while smoke drifted lazily upward toward the ceiling beams. These small duties did not seem unusual to the people around them. Life in Egypt depended on routine. Every hand mattered. Every hour of daylight mattered. The river rose and fell in its season. The crops grew and were harvested. Bread was baked. Fish were dried beneath the sun. And children learned early that the world expected something from them. Before the heat of noon arrived, narrow streets already filled with movement. Donkeys stepped slowly over stone roads carrying sacks of grain. Merchants opened shaded stalls beneath hanging cloth awnings. Fishermen returned from the river with baskets that smelled of wet reeds and fresh fish. The city breathed awake. And among the crowds walked children who were no longer treated fully like children. Some worked beside stone cutters near temple walls. Others mixed clay for brick makers beneath the harsh sunlight. Young servants hurried silently through large homes carrying water jars heavy against their thin arms. Their days were long. The heat settled over everything like a blanket that never lifted. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Sandals scraped softly over stone floors. And somewhere nearby, scribes sat cross-legged in shaded rooms, carefully brushing ink onto papyrus while students watched with tired eyes. For a small number of children, especially boys from wealthier families, education offered another path. But even learning carried pressure. A young scribe's life began early. Before sunrise, a boy might sit beside his teacher in a narrow schoolroom attached to a temple or government building. The room smelled of ink, old reeds, sweat, and dust warmed by morning light. He copied symbols again and again. Carefully. Slowly. Patiently. Mistakes were not welcomed. Teachers believed discipline shaped the mind like a sculptor shaped stone. Long hours passed in silence except for the scratching of reed pens against rough surfaces. Outside, the city moved beneath the bright Egyptian sun. But inside the schoolroom, children remained bent over their work while flies drifted lazily through shafts of warm light. Many became tired before midday. Their backs ached. Their hands cramped. But the lessons continued. The Egyptians admired order. They admired obedience and skill. A successful scribe could avoid the hardest physical labor and rise into an important place within society. Parents understood this deeply. And so children studied not for joy, but for survival. In wealthier homes, fathers sometimes spoke softly to their sons during the evening meal. The air inside the home remained hot even after sunset. Clay ovens still radiated warmth into small courtyards. Family members sat together eating bread, lentils, onions, dates, and sometimes fish from the Nile. Oil lamps flickered gently beside them. And fathers reminded their sons that life was difficult for laborers. They described workers bent beneath the sun carrying stone blocks for temples and tombs. They spoke of farmers standing knee-deep in muddy water while insects bit their skin beneath the burning heat. A scribe, they explained, lived differently. A scribe sat in shade. A scribe used his mind instead of his body. A scribe could eat more comfortably and sleep more peacefully. So children listened quietly while chewing soft bread in the dim light of the evening. And slowly, childhood became tied to expectation. Not all children learned to read. Most did not. Many grew into the same labor their parents already knew. In farming villages south of the great cities, boys followed their fathers into the fields almost as soon as they were strong enough to carry tools. The mornings began before dawn while the stars still hung over the silent desert. Cool air drifted through mud brick homes. Roosters cried softly in distant courtyards. Mothers prepared simple meals in darkness while embers from last night's fire glowed faintly beneath ashes. Then families stepped outside into the gray-blue light of early morning. The earth smelled damp near the riverbanks. Frogs moved through shallow water. Palm trees swayed slowly overhead. Children walked barefoot through cool mud before the sun rose high enough to burn the ground beneath their feet. The work itself was repetitive. Quiet. Endless. Seeds were planted by hand. Water channels were opened and closed carefully. Heavy baskets were lifted and carried again and again. And children learned not to complain. Complaining changed nothing beneath the Egyptian sun. By midday, heat shimmered across the fields. The air itself felt thick and slow. Workers rested briefly beneath woven shelters made from reeds and cloth while drinking water from clay jars cooled by evaporation. Children rested too. But even rest carried exhaustion. Dust covered their skin. Sweat dried against their necks. Their eyelids grew heavy beneath the endless brightness of the afternoon. Some fell asleep sitting upright beside baskets of grain. Then work resumed. The rhythm of labor shaped nearly every part of life. And over time, childhood itself became smaller. There were still moments of joy, of course. Children laughed beside the river while splashing in shallow water during cooler evenings. Some played simple games with carved wooden toys or rolled hoops through narrow streets while dogs chased after them. Girls braided each other's hair beneath shaded courtyards. Boys climbed date palms despite warnings from tired parents. Music sometimes drifted from homes during festivals when drums and flutes echoed softly through crowded neighborhoods. But these moments floated between long hours of duty. Life moved according to necessity. The Nile demanded work. The state demanded work. Families demanded work. Even inside wealthy homes where servants carried out much of the physical labor, children faced strict expectations. Young noble boys trained in reading, writing, religion, and administration. They practiced manners carefully. They learned how to stand before officials, how to speak respectfully, how to obey ritual and tradition. Young girls learned household management, weaving, music, and religious customs expected within elite society. Everything prepared them for future roles. Everything shaped them into useful adults. And so the softness of childhood slowly faded beneath preparation. During the flood season, when Nile waters spread across the land, villages changed their routines. Fields disappeared beneath broad stretches of muddy water that reflected the pale sky. Farmers repaired tools. Boats carried goods between flooded settlements. Workers traveled to larger building projects organized by the state. Children often went with them. Near construction sites, the air sounded different. Stone scraped against stone. Wooden sledges groaned across packed earth. Foremen shouted instructions while workers hauled limestone blocks beneath glaring sunlight. Dust floated everywhere. Fine white powder settled into hair, eyes, and lungs. Young boys carried water to workers or gathered tools scattered near unfinished walls. Older children learned trades beside craftsmen shaping statues, painting tombs, or carving symbols into stone. Inside workshop spaces, the smell of wet clay mixed with sweat and smoke from small fires used for metalworking. Apprentices watched older workers carefully because mistakes wasted precious materials. Patience mattered. Precision mattered. Even children understood this. As the years passed, their small responsibilities grew heavier. A child who once carried water now carried bricks. A child who once copied simple symbols now memorized long passages and official records. A child who once chased birds from fields now worked from sunrise until darkness. And no one around them seemed surprised. The ancient world expected maturity early. Illness also shaped childhood quietly and constantly. The Nile gave life, but it also carried disease. Mosquitoes hovered over standing water at dusk. In crowded homes, sickness moved easily between family members sleeping close together in warm air that barely moved during summer nights. Children became weak from fever. Some recovered slowly. Others did not recover at all. Families understood loss in a way that felt ordinary and deeply painful at the same time. A mother might continue grinding grain while quietly mourning a child lost only weeks earlier. A father might return to the fields the morning after a burial because crops still needed tending. Life continued. The river continued. And surviving children often carried even more responsibility afterward. At night, after long days of labor, homes became quieter. The sky darkened over the Nile. Temple fires flickered in the distance. Workers returned through narrow streets with slow footsteps and tired shoulders. Inside homes, evening meals were simple and repetitive. Bread remained the center of nearly every table. Sometimes there were beans or lentils cooked slowly in clay pots. Sometimes dried fish. Sometimes dates soaked in honey for special occasions. Children ate hungrily. Then many fell asleep almost immediately. The floors beneath them remained warm from the day's heat. Thin blankets covered small bodies curled close together beneath open windows where faint breezes drifted in from the river. Outside, Egypt softened into silence. A donkey shifted somewhere in the darkness. Water touched softly against wooden boats tied near the riverbank. Palm leaves rustled gently overhead. and exhausted children slept beside dreams shaped by labor, routine, and expectation. Far from the great temples and royal palaces that later generations would remember most, ordinary families lived these same patterns again and again across centuries. Their names disappeared. Their stories faded. But their routines built the foundation of Egyptian life. A baker's child woke before dawn to prepare ovens. A fisherman's son untangled wet nets beside the Nile. A potter's daughter carried clay jars drying beneath the morning sun. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing, childhood became less about freedom and more about readiness. Parents rarely intended cruelty. Most simply feared hardship. They understood hunger. They understood exhaustion. They understood how quickly fortune could disappear after poor harvests or illness. So they prepared their children early because the world itself felt uncertain and heavy. A father teaching his son to farm believed he was protecting him. A mother teaching her daughter endless household routines believed she was ensuring survival. Even strict teachers believed discipline created stability. And beneath all of this rested a quiet truth that shaped the ancient world. Life was fragile. The desert surrounded everything. Without work, the fields failed. Without obedience, society weakened. Without preparation, survival became dangerous. So children carried expectations long before they understood why. In larger cities like Thebes or Memphis, crowded neighborhoods never fully rested. Even late at night, soft movement continued through the streets. Bread ovens glowed red behind workshop walls. Guards walked slowly beside government buildings holding spears that reflected moonlight. Boats drifted silently along canals carrying goods that needed to arrive before morning markets opened. And inside small homes packed closely together, tired families slept shoulder to shoulder while warm air settled heavily around them. Children often heard adult conversations before falling asleep. They heard worries about taxes. Worries about floods arriving too early or too late. Worries about grain storage, sickness, injuries, and debt. These quiet nighttime conversations shaped childhood as much as labor itself. A young boy lying awake beside his brothers understood that someday he would carry the same burdens. A young girl listening beside the doorway understood that soon she would manage a household of her own. The future arrived early in ancient Egypt. Even play sometimes reflected adult responsibilities. Children made small boats from reeds and floated them through shallow water channels like the trading vessels they watched on the Nile each day. They molded tiny clay animals and storage jars similar to those used by workers around them. The adult world surrounded them constantly. There was little separation between childhood and responsibility. And perhaps that is why exhaustion settled so deeply into ordinary life. Not sudden exhaustion. Not dramatic suffering. But a slow and constant tiredness carried quietly across generations. The tiredness of waking before dawn every morning. The tiredness of heavy heat pressing down on fields and workshops. The tiredness of repeating the same labor beneath the same sun year after year. Children absorbed this rhythm naturally because everyone around them lived within it. Sometimes, during religious festivals, life softened briefly. Temples filled with music and incense. Families gathered along decorated streets while priests carried sacred statues beneath embroidered cloth canopies. Vendors sold sweet cakes and beer flavored with dates or herbs. Children watched with wide eyes while torchlight flickered across painted walls and polished jewelry. For a little while, work slowed. People laughed more easily. The city breathed differently. But festivals ended. Morning always returned. And with it came the familiar routines waiting beneath the first pale light over the Nile. A boy rose from sleep while rubbing dust from his eyes. A girl rekindled cooking fires before sunrise. Sandals touched cool stone floors. Doors opened onto narrow streets already warming beneath the coming day. And somewhere in the distance, the river continued flowing patiently through the ancient world. Before the first light touched the tops of the palm trees, the city already carried the quiet sounds of waking life. A woman swept dust from the doorway of her home using a bundle of dry reeds. Somewhere nearby, a clay jar scraped softly against stone as water was poured into a cooking pot. A sleepy child coughed beneath a thin linen blanket while warm air drifted slowly through the room. The Nile moved in darkness beyond the houses. Its black surface reflected faint stars that still lingered in the western sky. Along the riverbanks, fishermen prepared their boats in silence. Nets hung damp beside them, carrying the smell of water, reeds, and old wood softened by years of use. The world before sunrise felt gentler, cooler. For a short while, Egypt rested between night and labor. Children often woke during this quiet hour. Some rose willingly because routine had shaped their bodies from a young age. Others struggled to open tired eyes while parents spoke softly nearby. Little hands rubbed sleep away while feet searched for worn sandals resting beside woven mats. There was rarely much time to wake slowly. The day was already waiting. Inside many homes, breakfast was simple and small. Coarse bread rested on low tables beside onions, beans, or leftover fish from the evening before. Water jars cooled the air around them with faint traces of moisture. Sometimes children ate while still half asleep, chewing slowly in the dim light of flickering oil lamps. Then work began again. In farming villages near the river, children stepped into the early morning fields beside adults whose bodies already carried years of strain. The earth felt cool at first beneath bare feet. Mud pressed softly between toes near irrigation channels fed by Nile water. Birds circled low across the fields. The horizon slowly brightened. And another long day quietly unfolded. Young boys often learned farming by watching first. They watched how fathers studied the soil. How water was guided through narrow channels. How seeds were scattered carefully by hand. Nothing moved quickly. The labor followed rhythms older than memory itself. A father might speak only a few words during the morning hours. The sound of insects, water, and rustling grain filled most of the silence. Children learned through repetition more than instruction. Carry this basket. Bring that tool. Watch the water level. Stand there and scare the birds away. Small tasks became larger ones with time. And childhood slowly narrowed beneath responsibility. Girls learned different rhythms, though their labor was no lighter. Inside village homes, mornings filled with the sound of grinding grain. Large stones scraped steadily against one another while flour dust floated softly through warm air. Young girls sat beside mothers or older sisters, repeating movements that would become part of daily life for years ahead. Their arms often ached. Grinding grain took strength. Hour after hour, stone pressed against stone while sunlight slowly entered the room through small windows cut into thick mud brick walls. Nearby, bread dough rested beneath cloth coverings while ovens heated with dried reeds and animal dung used for fuel. Smoke drifted upward and gathered along ceiling beams darkened by years of cooking fires. Children worked within these spaces almost constantly. The home itself functioned like a workshop. Every object carried purpose. Every movement supported survival. In larger towns, apprenticeships shaped many childhoods. A potter's son might spend his early years carrying wet clay from the riverbank before ever touching a wheel himself. His fingers stayed coated in cool gray mud while he watched older craftsmen shape jars, bowls, and storage vessels with calm practiced movements. The workshop smelled of wet earth and smoke. Finished pottery dried in rows beneath the sun outside while flies buzzed lazily through the heavy afternoon air. At first, children only observed. Then they cleaned tools. Then they prepared materials. Eventually they practiced simple work under careful supervision. Mistakes mattered because materials were precious. A cracked storage jar meant wasted labor. A poorly shaped vessel reflected badly on the workshop. So children learned patience early. Elsewhere, young girls learned weaving inside shaded courtyards where linen threads stretched tightly across wooden frames. Their fingers moved carefully while older women corrected small errors with quiet voices. The work demanded attention. Tiny mistakes became visible later when cloth was finished and traded in crowded markets. Children often sat for long hours beside these looms while the afternoon heat settled heavily around them. Sweat gathered at the backs of their necks. Dust drifted through shafts of sunlight. Still the weaving continued. Again and again. Day after day. In wealthier homes, education remained strict and demanding. A noble child lived differently from a farmer's child, yet pressure surrounded both lives in different ways. Young boys training as scribes spent endless hours memorizing symbols and copying texts. They learned mathematics used for measuring fields, counting grain, and organizing taxes. Teachers expected precision and obedience. Schoolrooms could feel quiet and tense. Children sat cross-legged on reed mats while instructors watched closely. Reed pens scratched against papyrus or wooden boards coated with plaster. Sometimes only the sound of writing filled the room for long stretches of time. Outside, sunlight baked the city streets. Inside, children concentrated until their eyes grew tired. Some dreamed of becoming respected officials. Others simply feared punishment for mistakes. Discipline was considered necessary. An old Egyptian saying compared a child's ear to his back, meaning he listened best after physical correction. Teachers believed hardship strengthened character. Many parents agreed. And so childhood often became deeply tied to endurance. Not only physical endurance beneath heat and labor, but emotional endurance too. Children learned to remain quiet, to obey quickly, to continue working even when tired. Especially when tired. By midday, the Egyptian sun became nearly unbearable. Heat rose from stone roads in trembling waves. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while searching for narrow strips of shade beside walls and market stalls. Donkeys stood motionless beneath the sunlight with lowered heads and half-closed eyes. Children felt the same exhaustion as adults. Their smaller bodies tired quickly beneath the heavy air. Some carried water jars through crowded streets while sweat darkened their linen clothing. Others delivered goods between workshops or helped family members sell vegetables, fish, or woven baskets in noisy marketplaces filled with flies and dust. The smells of the city mixed together constantly. Fresh bread. Fish drying beneath the sun. Smoke from cooking fires. Animals crowded into narrow spaces. Sweat. Mud from the riverbanks. Warm beer poured into clay cups. Life felt close and crowded everywhere. And within this crowded world, children learned adult responsibilities early because there was little room for softness. Even rest often carried purpose. During the hottest hours, some workers paused briefly beneath shaded shelters or inside thick-walled homes where mud bricks trapped cooler air. Children rested there too, lying quietly on woven mats while listening to distant market sounds drifting through open windows. But rest rarely lasted long. Soon someone needed water. Someone needed bread delivered. Someone needed tools carried across town. The routines resumed almost immediately. Along the Nile itself, childhood followed the river's rhythm closely. Fishing families lived beside docks crowded with boats tied together using rough rope darkened by water and age. Young boys learned how to untangle nets almost before they learned to swim. Their fingers moved patiently through knots while fathers repaired wooden poles nearby. The river smelled alive. Wet reeds bent softly along the banks. Fish scales flashed silver beneath morning light. Birds waited motionless in shallow water before suddenly striking downward. Children watched everything. And eventually they joined everything. Some learned to steer small boats through narrow channels. Others carried baskets of fish to market before sunrise while mist still hovered low over the water. River life required constant effort. Storms damaged boats. Floods changed shorelines. Crocodiles waited silently near muddy banks. Yet the Nile also provided food, transport, and survival itself. Families depended on it completely. So children grew up understanding both the comfort and danger carried within the river. At night, after long days beside water and sun, fishing villages became deeply quiet. Boats knocked gently together in darkness. Small fires glowed beside the shore where meals cooked slowly in clay pots. Children slept heavily from exhaustion while adults spoke softly nearby about weather, fishing conditions, taxes, or repairs needed before morning. Above them, the stars remained bright and endless. Without modern lights, the night sky over ancient Egypt stretched with extraordinary clarity. Constellations reflected softly across calm river water while desert winds moved gently through palm branches. For tired children, these nights sometimes brought the only true stillness of the day. And even then, tomorrow already waited. In homes belonging to craftsmen, children inherited not only labor but identity itself. A stonemason's son became expected to understand stone. A carpenter's daughter understood wood, tools, and storage. Skills passed quietly through generations like river water moving endlessly northward. This inheritance could bring pride. But it also carried pressure. A child born into a respected trade represented the family's future survival. Parents watched carefully for signs of laziness or carelessness because mistakes threatened more than individual success. Mistakes threatened stability. And stability mattered deeply in the ancient world. The Egyptian state itself depended on organized labor. Monumental buildings, temples, irrigation systems, and royal tombs required enormous numbers of workers operating within carefully managed systems. Even children indirectly supported these structures through family labor. When taxes increased, families worked harder. When state projects expanded, more laborers traveled for seasonal work. Children adapted alongside adults because there was no alternative. Near large construction sites, temporary worker villages appeared beside unfinished temples and tombs. Rows of mud brick homes stood close together beneath harsh sunlight. Dust coated everything. Children living there experienced unusual childhoods shaped by constant movement and labor. They watched massive stone blocks dragged across packed roads by teams of exhausted workers. They heard hammering echo through valleys where tomb walls were carved deep into desert cliffs. At night, tired laborers returned home slowly with aching muscles and cracked hands. Children often helped care for younger siblings while adults rested briefly before sleep. Meals remained simple. Bread, beer, onions. Sometimes dried fish. Sometimes figs or dates. Enough to continue working. The body itself became central to survival. Children understood this early because they watched bodies fail. An injured worker might lose his ability to provide food. A fever could weaken someone for weeks during critical farming seasons. Malnutrition quietly shaped growth and strength, especially among poorer families. Life expectancy remained uncertain. And so adults pushed children toward readiness because childhood felt temporary. Some children resisted quietly. A boy might drift toward the river longer than necessary after filling water jars. A girl might pause beside musicians during a festival while errands waited unfinished at home. Small moments of wandering existed. Small acts of slowness existed. But eventually duty returned. Always. The structure of society left little space for long innocence. Religion also shaped children's understanding of responsibility. The gods surrounded daily life constantly. Temples towered over cities with painted columns glowing beneath sunlight. Priests carried offerings through incense-filled halls while prayers rose softly into warm air scented with oil and smoke. Children learned rituals early. They learned respect for the gods who controlled floods, harvests, sickness, and protection. Families prayed for health, successful crops, and safe births because survival always felt uncertain beneath the desert sky. Young children sometimes carried offerings to household shrines where small statues rested beside bowls of bread or flowers. They watched adults bow their heads before painted images lit by flickering lamps. Religion brought comfort. But it also reinforced order and duty. The world itself seemed carefully structured by divine balance. Everyone had a role within that balance. Even children. As evening approached each day, the light over Egypt softened beautifully. The harsh brightness of afternoon slowly faded into gold and copper tones that stretched across river water and temple walls. Workers returned home through streets cooling at last beneath lengthening shadows. Children walked more slowly then. Fatigue settled deeply into their small bodies after hours of labor and heat. Dust clung to their ankles. Their shoulders drooped beneath baskets or tools carried home. Yet evenings also brought gentle comforts. Cooking smells drifted from homes. Families gathered together. Voices softened. Mothers washed younger children using cool water poured carefully from clay jars. Fathers repaired tools while sitting beside doorways open to the evening breeze. Sometimes music floated through neighborhoods after dark. A flute played somewhere nearby. Quiet singing rose from a courtyard lit by oil lamps. Children listened while lying on woven mats beneath slowly turning night air. These small peaceful moments mattered deeply because they interrupted the endless rhythm of labor. But even peaceful evenings carried reminders of tomorrow. Tools waited beside doorways. Half-finished weaving rested on looms. School tablets remained stacked near sleeping mats. Nothing was ever fully finished. Life continued in cycles without clear endings. And children moved through those cycles almost as naturally as the Nile itself moved through Egypt. In wealthy households, servants handled much of the physical labor, yet noble children still faced emotional distance shaped by expectation and status. Sons prepared for administrative duties or priesthood. Daughters prepared for marriage alliances and household management. Affection existed, certainly. Parents loved their children. Ancient artwork often showed families embracing tenderly. But love lived beside discipline and social obligation. Children represented the continuation of family lines, property, and religious responsibilities. So even privileged childhoods rarely felt entirely free. Far from the cities, desert communities lived even harsher lives. Caravans crossed dry landscapes carrying copper, gold, incense, and precious stones. Children traveling with these groups experienced long days beneath open skies where heat shimmered endlessly above sand and rock. Water had to be rationed carefully. Animals needed tending. Travel never truly stopped until shelter appeared. At night, campfires flickered weakly against enormous darkness while tired travelers rested beneath blankets spread across cooling ground. Children there learned endurance perhaps earlier than anyone else. They learned silence too. The desert itself encouraged quiet. Wind moved softly over dunes. Stars stretched endlessly overhead. And human life felt very small beneath such vast empty spaces. Back beside the Nile, cities slowly settled into sleep once more. One by one, oil lamps dimmed behind windows. Workshops closed their doors. The final sounds of evening drifted away into darkness. Children slept deeply after long exhausting days, their breathing slow beneath the warm night air. Outside, the river continued its patient journey northward through the ancient land. And somewhere beyond the quiet homes and sleeping streets, another dawn was already beginning to wait. Long before sunrise, when the stars still shimmered above the Nile like scattered grains of silver, the first workers were already awake. The air carried a rare coolness then. For a little while, Egypt felt softer. Palm leaves whispered gently in the darkness. Water brushed against the edges of wooden boats tied along the riverbank. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster called out into the quiet sleeping world. Inside crowded homes made from mud brick, children slowly opened their eyes. Some had slept beside brothers and sisters on woven reed mats spread close together across stone floors. Others rested on flat rooftops beneath the night sky where the air moved more freely after the heat of the day. But no matter where they slept, morning arrived quickly. A mother stirred warm ashes back into flame near the cooking hearth. The smell of smoke drifted softly through the room. Clay pots rattled gently as water was poured. Bread from the previous day was broken into smaller pieces for breakfast. Children sat quietly while waking. Their hair remained tangled from sleep. Their eyes still heavy. Yet already the routines of labor waited outside the door. In many farming villages, the land itself shaped childhood more than anything else. The Nile gave life, but it demanded endless attention in return. Canals needed clearing. Fields needed planting. Animals needed feeding. Water levels needed watching carefully through every changing season. Children learned these rhythms almost before they learned language itself. A little boy walking beside his father at dawn already understood the smell of wet soil beside the river. He understood the feel of mud squeezing between his toes. He understood the sight of ibis birds standing motionless in shallow water while the sky slowly brightened over distant fields. The land became part of his body. And labor became part of daily breathing. Young girls also woke early, often before the sun itself appeared above the horizon. Their mornings unfolded within courtyards and kitchens already warming beneath small cooking fires. Grain had to be prepared. Water had to be carried. Clothing needed washing in river water or large clay basins. Babies needed tending. Even very young girls sometimes balanced younger siblings against their hips while helping prepare the morning meal. Their movements became practiced through repetition. Quiet repetition. The same tasks returned every day like the rising sun. Inside one small riverside home, a child might kneel beside a grinding stone before dawn while her mother prepared dough nearby. The room smelled of flour, smoke, warm clay, and human sweat carried through the night air. Outside, footsteps already sounded in the street. Workers passing. Animals moving slowly toward fields. Merchants preparing carts before the heat became unbearable. The city itself seemed to wake layer by layer beneath the growing light. And children rose with it. As the first sunlight touched temple walls and market roofs, Egypt became brighter and louder all at once. Donkeys brayed impatiently. Vendors called softly across crowded streets. Boats unloaded baskets of fish still wet from the river. Dust rose beneath countless footsteps moving through narrow roads lined with homes and workshops. Children moved through these streets constantly. A baker's son hurried with stacks of flatbread balanced carefully in woven baskets. A young servant carried water jars through crowded alleys while trying not to spill precious drops onto the ground. Apprentices opened workshop doors and swept away yesterday's dust before older craftsmen arrived. The smell of baking bread drifted everywhere in the morning hours. Warm grain, smoke, ash. It mixed with the scent of river mud and animals crowded close together near market spaces. Egypt smelled alive from the moment dawn arrived. And childhood existed inside all of it. For many families, there was little separation between home and labor. Workshops stood beside sleeping spaces. Animals rested near kitchens. Storage jars filled entire corners of homes where children also played, worked, and slept. A carpenter's child grew up listening to the sound of cutting wood. A metal worker's child smelled smoke and heated copper every day. A fisherman's child understood river currents before understanding numbers. Skills entered childhood naturally because work surrounded every moment of life. Near the great temples, children often watched priests moving through enormous stone halls lit by shafts of golden morning sunlight. Incense drifted through the air in pale twisting clouds while sacred songs echoed softly between towering columns painted with deep blues, reds, and gold. The temple seemed cool compared to the streets outside. Quiet too. For a few moments, children carrying deliveries or following parents through temple courtyards sometimes slowed their pace. They stared upward at massive statues standing motionless in the dim light. The gods appeared calm, still, untouched by exhaustion. But outside the temple walls, ordinary life continued beneath heat and labor. And children returned quickly to their responsibilities. In schools attached to temples or government buildings, young scribes began long hours of study soon after sunrise. Their education was respected because literacy remained rare and valuable. A scribe could organize taxes, record harvests, write legal agreements, communicate official orders. Such work carried status. But reaching that life demanded discipline from childhood onward. Schoolrooms remained plain and quiet. Students sat on reed mats while teachers dictated passages from memory. Reed pens scratched slowly across papyrus sheets or wooden writing boards coated with plaster. The children copied symbols again and again. Carefully. Repeatedly. Mistakes invited criticism. Sometimes punishment. The room often grew hot before midday. Sweat formed along children's foreheads while flies buzzed lazily near open windows. Outside, market sounds drifted faintly through the walls. But lessons continued without pause. A tired child might stare at symbols that blurred together before his eyes. His fingers cramped from holding the pen. His back ached from sitting still for hours. Yet he kept writing. Because his future depended on it. Many Egyptian texts written by scribes described physical labor as miserable and harsh. Teachers repeated these ideas often. They warned students about the suffering of farmers bent beneath the sun or laborers carrying stone until their bodies broke from exhaustion. Become skilled with writing, they said. Escape the hardest labor. And so children studied not because learning felt joyful, but because survival itself seemed to demand excellence. Elsewhere across Egypt, children without access to education faced a different future. By midday, fields stretched endlessly beneath brutal sunlight. Farmers wrapped cloth around their heads while oxen moved slowly through irrigation channels. The air shimmered above the earth. Children worked there too. Some stood ankle-deep in muddy water guiding animals through plowed fields. Others carried harvested grain bundled tightly against their shoulders. Tiny cuts from dry reeds marked their hands and legs. The heat pressed down on everything. Breathing itself felt heavy. Still the work continued. Water breaks remained short because daylight mattered too much to waste. In wealthier households, children lived among servants who performed much of the physical labor, yet those homes carried their own quiet tensions. Large houses surrounded shaded courtyards where pools reflected sunlight onto painted walls. Linen curtains shifted gently in the warm breeze. Servants moved silently through hallways carrying trays of food, oils, and fresh water. Noble children wore finer clothing and ate better meals than poor children. But their lives remained carefully controlled. Young boys practiced reading and etiquette beneath the watchful eyes of tutors. They learned how to speak formally, how to stand before officials, how to honor religious customs properly. Young girls learned weaving, music, household management, and preparation for marriage into important families. Their futures belonged not only to themselves, but to family expectations and social stability. Freedom remained limited even within comfort. As afternoon heat deepened, many parts of Egypt seemed to slow beneath the weight of the sun. Dogs slept beneath carts. Market vendors leaned wearily against shaded walls. Boats drifted quietly along the river while rowers paused to wipe sweat from their faces. Children also felt the exhaustion settling deep into their bodies. A young apprentice in a pottery workshop might sit briefly beside cooling jars while dust coated his skin in pale gray layers. A servant girl carrying laundry to the river might pause beneath a date palm for a few precious moments of shade. These small pauses mattered. They became tiny islands of rest inside endless routines. Yet true rest rarely lasted long. Soon another task arrived. Another errand. Another responsibility waiting patiently nearby. Life in ancient Egypt moved through cycles that never truly stopped. Evenings brought temporary relief from the heat. The sky softened into warm orange and deep purple tones above the Nile. Shadows stretched across temple walls and crowded streets. Workers slowly returned home carrying tools worn smooth by years of use. Children walked beside them with tired faces and dusty feet. The smells of evening cooking filled neighborhoods once more. Lentils simmered in clay pots. Fish roasted above small fires. Fresh bread cooled on woven trays while families gathered together after long days of labor. These evening hours often carried the greatest peace. Families sat close together in courtyards open to the sky. Oil lamps flickered softly while insects hummed in the darkness beyond the walls. Adults spoke quietly about harvests, repairs, taxes, marriages, illnesses, and the coming flood season. Children listened while eating simple meals beside them. Sometimes grandparents told stories from memory. Stories about old kings. Stories about clever animals. Stories about the gods guiding the Nile through the land. Children rested their heads against warm shoulders while listening. For a little while, exhaustion softened into comfort. Yet even peaceful evenings could not fully remove the pressures surrounding childhood. Tomorrow's work always remained close. A father might remind his son to wake earlier next time. A mother might correct her daughter's weaving technique beside the evening lamp. A teacher might assign more copying before morning lessons resumed. Preparation never ended. And slowly, many children began carrying adult anxieties long before adulthood itself arrived. Illness deepened this burden quietly across every social class. The Nile created fertile life, but standing water also spread disease. Insects swarmed near canals during warmer months. Contaminated water caused sickness that weakened entire households. Children often became ill from fevers, infections, stomach diseases, or malnutrition. Some recovered slowly while lying on mats beneath damp cloths placed across their foreheads. Others grew weaker with each passing day while worried parents whispered prayers beside small household shrines. Ancient medicine mixed practical treatment with spiritual belief. Healers used herbs, oils, honey, and prayers together. Families burned incense while asking the gods for protection. But death remained familiar. Many children never reached adulthood. And those who survived often matured quickly because loss surrounded ordinary life so closely. A boy who lost his father might suddenly inherit greater responsibilities within the family. A girl whose mother became ill might begin managing household tasks before she fully understood them herself. Childhood shifted easily into adulthood whenever necessity demanded it. No ceremony marked the change. It simply happened. The ancient world allowed little space for delay. At night, after the final meals were eaten and the streets slowly quieted, Egypt settled once more beneath darkness. The heat lingered inside stone walls long after sunset. Families carried sleeping mats onto rooftops where cooler air moved beneath the stars. Others slept inside courtyards beside slowly fading cooking fires. Children often fell asleep immediately from exhaustion. Their breathing deepened quickly. Hands still rough from labor rested beside tired faces. Some dreamed of river boats drifting through cool water. Some dreamed of festivals filled with music and torchlight. Some simply slept too deeply for dreams at all. Above them, the stars stretched endlessly across the Egyptian sky. Priests studied those stars carefully, believing the heavens reflected divine order. Farmers also watched them, using familiar constellations to track seasons and flooding cycles. Children learned the night sky naturally because darkness remained so clear beside the desert. Without artificial light, the stars seemed enormous. Comforting. Ancient. A child lying awake beside the Nile might hear water touching softly against reeds along the riverbank. He might hear distant voices fading through narrow streets or the quiet movement of boats traveling under moonlight. The world at night felt calmer. Slower. Yet even then, tomorrow waited patiently beyond the horizon. Morning would return. The ovens would need heating. The fields would need tending. The lessons would continue. And children across Egypt would once again rise from sleep into lives shaped by labor, expectation, and the endless rhythm of the Nile. During the quietest hour of the night, when even the dogs in the streets had stopped barking, the Nile continued moving through the darkness with slow and patient silence. The river never truly rested. Moonlight shimmered softly across the water. Reeds bent gently in the warm breeze. Far beyond the riverbanks, the desert remained still beneath endless stars, its pale sand glowing faintly beneath the night sky. Inside the cities and villages of Egypt, families slept closely together while the heat of the previous day remained trapped inside thick mud brick walls. Children turned quietly in their sleep. Some curled beneath thin linen cloths. Others slept uncovered, their skin warm from the heavy summer air. A baby stirred softly beside its mother. Somewhere nearby, an old wooden door creaked in the wind. And slowly, almost unnoticed, another day approached. For many children, life followed such steady routines that one season blended gently into another. The floodwaters rose and fell. Grain ripened beneath the sun. Boats arrived and departed. Festivals came and passed. But the expectations placed upon children only seemed to grow heavier with time. As boys became older and stronger, their labor increased naturally. A child once trusted only with carrying water might now spend entire days in the fields. Another who once cleaned tools in a workshop now shaped materials himself beneath the careful eyes of experienced craftsmen. There were few moments when adults formally announced this change. No sudden ceremony. No clear dividing line. One morning, a boy simply discovered he was now expected to work like a man. The same quiet transformation happened to girls. A young child who once watched bread being baked from the corner of the room now prepared the dough herself. Another who once played beside weaving frames now spent long afternoons working the loom while younger siblings slept nearby. Responsibility arrived gradually. But once it arrived, it rarely left. In farming communities near the Nile Delta, children grew familiar with endless open skies and flat green fields stretching toward distant canals. The land there was fertile and beautiful in its own quiet way. Birds drifted over the marshes. Fish flashed beneath shallow water. Tall grasses moved softly in the wind. Yet even beautiful places could feel exhausting beneath constant labor. The work followed the seasons closely. During planting season, children helped scatter seeds into freshly prepared soil while oxen pulled wooden plows through damp earth. Their feet sank into cool mud beneath the morning sun. Water glistened along irrigation channels beside them. Later, during harvest time, entire families worked together beneath dry golden fields that rustled softly in the hot breeze. Sickles sliced through grain while dust and bits of straw clung to sweaty skin. Children carried bundles almost as large as themselves. Again and again. Hour after hour. The sun climbed slowly overhead while the air became thick with heat and flying insects. Sometimes exhaustion settled so deeply into the body that even speaking felt difficult. Yet work continued because the harvest could not wait. Food for the coming year depended on these days. Everyone understood that. Even children. In larger cities, life carried different pressures but no less fatigue. The streets of places like Thebes or Memphis often felt crowded from sunrise until long after dark. Merchants called out from market stalls shaded beneath woven cloth canopies. Donkeys pushed through narrow roads carrying baskets filled with vegetables, pottery, fish, and linen. Children moved constantly through these crowded spaces. A servant boy might hurry between houses carrying messages for wealthy officials. A young girl balanced water jars against her shoulders while carefully stepping around stray dogs sleeping beside the road. The city smelled of many things at once. Fresh bread cooling on stone shelves. Smoke from cooking fires. Animal waste warming beneath the sun. Perfumed oils drifting from wealthy homes. Fish laid out for sale beside buzzing flies. Life pressed close together in ancient Egyptian cities. And children learned early how to move carefully within that crowded world. Near temple complexes, young apprentices trained beside skilled artists and craftsmen whose work decorated sacred buildings and royal tombs. These children often spent years learning precise techniques that demanded endless patience. Inside cool stone workshops, walls glowed softly beneath reflected sunlight entering through narrow openings high above. Pigments made from crushed minerals rested in small bowls beside brushes and carving tools. A child studying painting learned how to mix colors carefully from ochre, charcoal, copper, and ground stone. A child learning stone carving practiced shaping simple lines before touching important temple walls. Mistakes were corrected quickly. The gods deserved perfection. Kings demanded beauty. And so children trained carefully while older craftsmen watched in silence nearby. Many apprentices admired their teachers deeply. Skilled craftsmen held respected places within society because their work lasted long after ordinary lives faded away. Yet even respected work required sacrifice. Long hours bent over carvings damaged backs and hands. Fine dust-filled lungs during stone cutting. Eyes strained beneath dim workshop light. Children absorbed these hardships slowly over years until discomfort itself began to feel ordinary. At midday, the heat inside cities became almost unbearable during the summer months. Stone walls radiated warmth back into the streets. Animals stood motionless beneath narrow strips of shade. Workers wiped sweat from their faces while searching for cooler air that never fully arrived. Children often became dizzy from the heat. Their energy faded. Tempers grew shorter. Still, daily routines continued. Water sellers walked through markets carrying large jars cooled by damp cloth. Children sometimes followed behind them, hoping for small drinks during the hottest hours. Inside homes, women prepared midday meals while trying to keep fires burning low enough not to worsen the heat inside already crowded rooms. The smell of lentils cooking slowly in clay pots drifted through open windows. Babies cried softly. Older children rested briefly against cool walls before returning to their tasks. Ancient Egyptian homes offered little privacy. Families lived closely together, sharing work, meals, and sleep within small connected spaces. Children witnessed nearly everything around them. Births, illnesses, arguments, mourning. Adult worries became part of childhood naturally because walls were thin and life remained communal. A boy lying awake at night might hear his parents discussing unpaid taxes in low, worried voices. A girl helping prepare dinner might overhear relatives speaking quietly about a sick neighbor unlikely to recover. Children learned early that life carried uncertainty. The Nile could flood too weakly. Crops could fail. Disease could spread through entire neighborhoods. Accidents could injure workers permanently. These fears rarely disappeared completely from adult minds. And children absorbed them simply by growing up nearby. Even games and play sometimes reflected the seriousness of the adult world surrounding them. Children played with small carved animals, toy boats, and miniature household objects shaped from wood or clay. Some raced through dusty courtyards chasing hoops rolled with sticks. Others played simple counting games using pebbles or carved pieces. Their laughter echoed through narrow streets during cooler evenings. For short moments, childhood still felt light. Still joyful. But those moments often remained brief between long hours of labor and expectation. Parents rarely intended to remove happiness from childhood. Most simply believed preparation mattered more. An unprepared child faced hardship later. A disciplined child might survive more safely. At least that was the hope carried quietly through generations. Education continued shaping the lives of children fortunate enough to attend school. The path of the scribe remained highly respected because literacy offered escape from the harshest physical labor. Parents pushed children toward learning with great seriousness whenever opportunity allowed. Inside schoolrooms, students memorized long passages praising wisdom, obedience, and discipline. They copied old texts repeatedly until symbols became familiar through endless repetition. The lessons themselves often carried warnings. Texts described exhausted farmers bent beneath heavy burdens. Soldiers injured in distant campaigns. Laborers suffering beneath cruel overseers. The message remained clear: study hard. Endure hardship now. Avoid greater hardship later. For many children, this transformed learning into another form of pressure rather than curiosity. Their minds became workplaces too. Hours passed while teachers corrected writing line by line. The scratching sound of reed pens against writing boards filled the warm, still air. Outside, sunlight moved slowly across temple courtyards while children remained bent over their lessons. Some succeeded and rose into respected administrative positions later in life. Others failed and returned to physical labor despite years of study. Failure carried deep disappointment because entire families often sacrificed greatly to support education. Meanwhile, girls in wealthy households received different forms of training focused on household management, religion, music, and social customs. Though fewer girls became literate, many still carried enormous responsibilities within family life. A noble daughter might spend hours learning how to supervise servants, prepare ceremonial offerings, or manage food storage for large households. Her future marriage could shape alliances between families. Her behavior reflected family honor. Even privileged childhoods remained carefully guided by expectation. At sunset, Egypt softened beautifully once more. The sky above the Nile turned deep gold before fading slowly into purple and blue. Birds crossed overhead in dark shapes against the evening light. Workers returned home through streets cooling at last after long burning hours beneath the sun. Children walked more slowly then. Their bodies felt heavy with fatigue. Sandals scraped softly against dusty roads. Shoulders drooped beneath baskets and tools carried home from fields or workshops. Yet evening still brought comfort. Families gathered together near cooking fires while darkness slowly settled across the land. The smells of roasting fish, warm bread, onions, and herbs filled homes and courtyards. Oil lamps flickered gently. Someone poured beer into clay cups. Someone laughed quietly after a long difficult day. Children listened while adults spoke about ordinary things. A broken tool needing repair. A cousin preparing for marriage. Rumors about new taxes from officials upriver. The coming flood season. The changing weather. These conversations flowed gently through the evening air while insects hummed outside beneath the stars. Sometimes musicians passed through neighborhoods carrying small harps or flutes. Their songs drifted softly between mud brick walls while children grew sleepy beside their families. For a little while, life felt calm. Not easy, but calm. Then sleep slowly returned across Egypt. Families spread woven mats across floors and rooftops. Warm winds moved through open courtyards carrying the scent of river water and distant cooking fires finally fading into darkness. Children closed tired eyes. Some fell asleep while still hearing adult voices nearby. Others slept immediately from exhaustion so deep it felt almost dreamless. And outside, beneath the endless ancient sky, the Nile continued flowing silently through the land, carrying with it another quiet night of labor, expectation, and childhood slowly shaped into duty. Continue Part 5. The nights beside the Nile often ended too quickly. Darkness would settle gently over the land, bringing cooler air and quiet relief after the long burning hours of the day. Families would gather close together beneath oil lamps while soft winds drifted through open courtyards carrying the scent of river water and distant reeds. Children sometimes felt peaceful then. Their tired bodies relaxed at last. The sounds of labor faded into the background. But sleep in ancient Egypt rarely lasted long enough. Before dawn returned, movement began once more. A mother rose silently from her sleeping mat and stepped carefully across the stone floor so she would not wake the younger children too early. She uncovered glowing embers buried beneath ash and slowly breathed life back into the cooking fire. The faint crackling sound filled the darkness. Soon the smell of smoke drifted through the house. Outside, the streets remained mostly silent except for distant footsteps and the occasional soft cry of an animal somewhere beyond the walls. The sky above the Nile slowly changed from black to deep blue. Another day waited patiently at the edge of the horizon. Children learned to wake quickly because hesitation only made the mornings harder. A young boy might sit upright while still half asleep, rubbing dust from his eyes with tired hands. Beside him, An older sister folded blankets and prepared water jars for the morning chores already waiting outside. No one moved with great energy. People moved with routine. Their bodies understood what the day required before their minds fully woke. Inside poorer homes, breakfast remained small and simple. Dry bread softened in water. Sometimes onions. Sometimes dates if the family could afford them. In fishing communities, leftover fish from the evening meal might still rest near the hearth wrapped carefully in cloth. Children ate quietly. Then they stepped into the waking world. Along the Nile River, mist often hovered low above the water during the earliest hours of morning. Boats drifted silently beside muddy banks while fishermen prepared nets beneath fading starlight. The river smelled cool before sunrise. Cooler than the streets. Cooler than the fields. For a short while, the world felt calm and almost gentle. Young boys working with fishing families often loved these moments despite the labor waiting ahead. They stood barefoot at the edge of the water while older men untangled ropes nearby. Wet reeds brushed softly against their ankles. Birds called out across the riverbanks. Then work began. Nets were lifted. Boats pushed away from shore. The silence disappeared beneath the sounds of labor. Children learned quickly how heavy wet fishing nets became when filled with struggling fish. Their small hands tightened against rough rope darkened by water and age. The smell of river mud and scales clung to their skin long after the work ended. Still, many fishing families depended entirely on what the Nile provided each morning. Every catch mattered. Every child helping beside the river mattered too. Farther inland, farming villages slowly brightened beneath the rising sun. Palm trees cast long shadows across irrigation canals while workers crossed fields carrying wooden tools over their shoulders. Children followed beside them. The land itself seemed endless during planting and harvest seasons. Wide green fields stretched toward the horizon beneath open skies already warming with light. At first the mornings felt pleasant enough. Cool mud beneath bare feet. Fresh air moving through the crops. Birdsong drifting overhead. But everyone knew the heat would arrive soon. It always arrived. By mid-morning, sweat already covered the bodies of workers bent low over the fields. Children wiped dust from their faces with tired hands while continuing their tasks beside parents and older siblings. The work rarely changed. Planting. Cutting. Carrying. Watering. Repairing canals. Gathering grain. Repeating the same movements again and again beneath the Egyptian sun. Some children became so accustomed to labor that they barely noticed their own exhaustion anymore. Tiredness simply became part of ordinary life, like the river or the heat or the blowing desert wind. Adults noticed this too. Yet many believed hardship strengthened children. A boy who learned endurance early would survive difficult years more easily later. A girl who mastered household labor young would someday manage her own family successfully. At least this was the belief carried quietly through countless generations beside the Nile. Inside crowded cities, childhood unfolded differently but no less heavily. The streets of Thebes awakened with constant movement each morning. Merchants opened wooden shutters beside market stalls while donkeys carrying baskets squeezed through narrow roads already filling with people. Children hurried everywhere. A servant girl balanced clay jars filled with water against her shoulders while trying to avoid colliding with passing laborers. An apprentice baker carried warm loaves from the ovens while smoke curled upward into the brightening sky. The smells of the city thickened as the day grew warmer. Bread baking. Animals sweating beneath heavy loads. Fish drying in the sun. Incense burning near temple entrances. Smoke from countless cooking fires. Dust rising beneath thousands of footsteps. For children born into city life, these smells became deeply familiar. The city entered their lungs and clothing from the moment they woke until the moment sleep finally returned at night. Many children worked inside workshops where craftsmen shaped nearly every object used throughout Egyptian life. Pottery workshops remained hot even during cooler seasons. Kilns radiated heavy warmth while workers shaped clay on spinning wheels darkened by years of use. Apprentices carried wet vessels carefully between work tables while trying not to damage freshly formed pottery. A child learning this trade often spent years completing simple repetitive tasks before receiving permission to shape important pieces independently. Patience mattered deeply. Older craftsmen watched closely for signs of carelessness. A cracked storage jar wasted valuable materials and labor. So children learned precision slowly through endless repetition. Nearby, weaving workshops carried their own quiet rhythm. Linen threads stretched tightly across wooden looms while women and girls worked carefully beneath narrow strips of shade. Their fingers moved steadily hour after hour through patterns memorized over years of practice. The sound of weaving filled the air softly. Wood creaking. Thread tightening. Quiet breathing in the heavy afternoon heat. Young girls often began learning these skills very early because weaving remained essential within nearly every household. Clothing. Bedding. Trade goods. Ceremonial fabrics. All depended on careful patient labor. And so childhood slowly became training for endless future responsibilities. Even wealthier children lived beneath constant preparation. In large homes surrounded by painted walls and shaded courtyards, noble boys studied reading, mathematics, religion, and administration from a young age. Tutors corrected posture, speech, and behavior carefully because future officials represented not only themselves, but their entire family line. A noble child might spend long mornings copying formal texts while servants moved quietly through cool stone hallways nearby. The air smelled faintly of scented oils and polished wood rather than dust and smoke. Yet pressure still shaped daily life. Success carried expectation. Failure carried shame. Childhood remained connected to future duty no matter one's social class. Girls from wealthy families also lived within carefully structured routines. They learned music, religious customs, household management, and the social behaviors expected of elite women. Marriage would eventually connect families and property. Everything prepared them for that future. Even moments of leisure often served educational purposes. Nothing felt entirely free from expectation. By midday, heat settled over Egypt like a great invisible weight. The sun reflected harshly from stone walls and pale desert sand beyond the riverbanks. Marketplaces slowed as merchants searched desperately for shade beneath cloth coverings stretched between buildings. Children felt the heat deeply. Their energy faded. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Dust clung to damp skin. A young worker carrying water jars across the city might pause briefly beside a shaded wall while catching his breath. A girl tending younger siblings inside a crowded home might fan them gently while trying to keep flies away from the midday meal. Even breathing felt slower during these hours. The entire land seemed to grow tired beneath the burning sky. Still, labor continued. Temple workers swept courtyards. Farmers guided water through canals. Servants cleaned floors and prepared food. Scribes bent over records and calculations. Children remained part of all these routines. There was rarely an age when one was considered too young to contribute something. The ancient world depended on many hands working together constantly. During flood season, when Nile waters spread wide across the land, life changed shape but not pace. Boats traveled between villages where roads disappeared beneath muddy water. Workers repaired tools and homes damaged by rising floods. State projects often expanded during the season because farming temporarily paused in flooded regions. Children sometimes traveled with adults to large building sites where enormous temples and tombs slowly rose from stone and desert cliffs. These places felt immense. Massive columns towered overhead. Half-finished statues rested beside roads coated in white dust. Teams of workers hauled limestone blocks beneath the sun while overseers watched carefully nearby. Children living around such sites witnessed endless labor on a scale difficult even for adults to fully understand. A boy carrying water to stonecutters might spend entire days listening to hammering echo through the dry valley air. A young apprentice painter prepared pigments while older artists decorated tomb walls with scenes of harvests, feasts, gods, and eternal life. The work seemed endless because many projects lasted decades. Some workers spent their entire lives helping complete structures they would never see fully finished. Children growing up there inherited those same routines naturally. At night, worker villages settled slowly into silence after exhausting days. Cooking fires flickered outside rows of mud brick homes. Families gathered together eating bread and lentils beneath warm desert winds carrying fine dust through the air. Children often fell asleep before meals fully ended. Their bodies simply surrendered to exhaustion. Nearby, adults spoke quietly about injuries, supplies, weather, and work assignments for tomorrow. Always tomorrow. Another day already waiting. Illness remained a constant shadow across every part of Egyptian life. Children frequently suffered from infections caused by dirty water, insects, poor nutrition, or crowded living conditions. Many carried coughs that lingered for weeks. Others developed fevers during the hottest months when disease spread more easily through villages and cities alike. Families cared for sick children with deep tenderness. Mothers placed cool cloths against burning foreheads. Fathers brought herbs or prayers from local healers. Relatives gathered nearby whispering softly in lamplight while hoping fever would pass before morning. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. Loss became woven quietly into ordinary life. And surviving children often grew more serious afterward, as though responsibility settled upon them even more heavily after witnessing how fragile life could become. As evening finally returned across Egypt, the land softened once more beneath fading sunlight. The Nile glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Birds crossed the darkening sky. Workers returned home slowly through dusty streets carrying tools worn smooth by years of use. Children walked beside them in silence. Too tired for games now. Too tired for much conversation at all. Yet evening still carried small comforts. Warm bread torn apart by hand. Cool water poured from clay jars. The quiet murmur of family voices. Music drifting faintly from somewhere beyond the courtyard walls. These moments mattered deeply because they offered rest not only for the body, but for the mind. Children leaned against parents while listening to familiar conversations and stories repeated many times before. Oil lamps flickered gently across tired faces. Outside, the desert wind moved softly through palm trees beneath the first appearing stars. And little by little, ancient Egypt drifted once more toward sleep. Late at night, after the final cooking fires had dimmed into soft red embers, Egypt became quiet in a way that felt deep and endless. The crowded streets emptied slowly beneath the stars. Market stalls stood abandoned beneath hanging cloth canopies that moved gently in the warm night breeze. Donkeys rested beside walls with lowered heads while stray dogs wandered silently through the darkness searching for scraps left behind after the evening meal. The Nile flowed beside it all with patient calm. Moonlight touched the surface of the water in pale silver lines. Small boats rocked gently against wooden docks. Reeds whispered softly near the riverbanks where insects hummed in the thick summer air. Children slept nearby in homes made from mud brick and stone, their tired bodies stretched across woven mats after another day shaped by labor and expectation. Some slept deeply. Others shifted restlessly beneath the heat. Even at night, the warmth lingered inside the walls. A child lying awake might hear distant voices drifting through an open window. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried softly before becoming quiet again. Farther away, someone coughed in the darkness. Then silence slowly returned. The ancient world rarely moved quickly. Everything unfolded with repetition. The same roads filled each morning. The same ovens baked bread. The same boats crossed the Nile carrying grain, fish, stone, and people from one shore to another. And children grew within those repeating rhythms until work itself began to feel as natural as breathing. Before dawn, the first sounds of waking life slowly spread across the villages along the river. Sandals touched stone floors. Doors creaked open. Clay jars knocked softly together. The sky above the eastern horizon lightened little by little while cool air still drifted through the streets. This brief coolness mattered deeply. Workers hurried to begin difficult tasks before the full heat arrived. Children understood this too. A young boy helping in the fields might already walk beside his father while the stars still faded overhead. Their shadows stretched long across damp earth darkened by river water. Frogs moved quietly beside irrigation channels. The morning smelled alive. Wet soil. Palm trees. River reeds. Smoke rising from distant cooking fires. The beauty of early Egypt often existed beside exhaustion rather than separate from it. Children noticed the softness of sunrise even while carrying tools. They heard birdsong while already preparing for labor. Perhaps this made life feel both peaceful and heavy at the same time. In farming regions, entire families depended upon careful timing throughout the agricultural year. The flooding of the Nile determined planting seasons, harvest schedules, taxes, and food supplies. Nothing could be neglected for long. A broken irrigation canal threatened crops. Poor harvests threatened survival. So children became workers early because families needed every available hand. Even very small children sometimes guarded crops from birds by waving sticks or shouting across the fields beneath the morning sky. Older children carried water, gathered reeds, tended animals, and learned how to manage tools worn smooth from generations of use. The work rarely ended completely. When fields rested, homes demanded attention. When homes grew quiet, workshops still required labor. A child moving through ancient Egypt rarely experienced long periods free from responsibility. Inside homes, girls often carried invisible burdens that filled nearly every hour of the day. A young girl might wake before sunrise to help grind grain while younger siblings still slept nearby. The heavy grinding stone pressed against her hands again and again while flour dust gathered across her skin and clothing. The sound itself became part of daily life. Stone against stone. Slow. Steady. Endless. Afterward came baking, cleaning, washing clothing, carrying water, preparing meals, weaving cloth, tending younger children, and countless smaller tasks woven quietly through the day. Adults often praised girls who worked silently and efficiently. Obedience was admired. Patience was admired. Endurance was admired most of all. Many girls learned early to hide exhaustion behind calm expressions because complaints changed very little. The work still waited. In wealthier households, servants performed much of the hardest physical labor, yet noble children also lived beneath constant supervision. A noble boy might spend his mornings memorizing official texts while a tutor corrected every mistake with strict attention. He learned how to write formal records, how to calculate grain supplies, and how to speak respectfully before powerful officials. The future expected competence from him. Anything less risked embarrassment for the family. Young noble girls also lived within carefully ordered routines. They learned music, religious rituals, household management, and social customs expected among elite families. Their clothing felt softer. Their homes cooler. But expectations still surrounded them constantly. Childhood often became preparation rather than freedom, no matter where one stood within society. As the day advanced, Egypt brightened beneath harsh sunlight that turned stone walls almost white beneath the heat. By midday, the streets slowed beneath the burning sky. Merchants rested beside their stalls while fanning away flies. Workers searched for strips of shade cast by temple walls and narrow alleyways. The air itself felt heavy and unmoving. Children grew tired then. Very tired. A boy apprenticed to a stonecutter might sit silently beside unfinished blocks while dust coated his hair and arms. Nearby, older craftsmen shaped limestone using copper tools that rang softly through the dry air. The work demanded concentration. One careless strike damaged weeks of labor. So children learned caution alongside exhaustion. Elsewhere, in weaving rooms dimmed against the sunlight, girls worked beside wooden looms while heat gathered beneath the ceiling. Linen threads stretched tightly between beams while fingers moved carefully through repetitive motions practiced every day. The room smelled faintly of cloth, oil, and human sweat. Flies drifted lazily through narrow beams of light. No one spoke very much. There was too much work remaining. Children often entered apprenticeships through family connections. Trades passed naturally from one generation to another because survival depended upon practical knowledge carried through memory and routine. A potter's child learned clay. A carpenter's child learned wood. A brewer's child learned grain and fermentation. This inheritance brought stability, but it also narrowed possibility. Most children already understood their future long before adulthood arrived. The path ahead rarely felt uncertain. Only difficult. Near the temples, religious life shaped childhood in quieter ways. Children watched priests carrying offerings through incense-filled halls where painted columns towered high overhead. Sacred songs echoed softly through cool chambers protected from the brutal sun outside. For a few moments, temples offered stillness. Order. Shade. The gods seemed eternal there. Untroubled by hunger or fatigue. Families taught children to respect this sacred order deeply because religion explained the balance of the world itself. The flooding river, the growing crops, the movement of stars, the survival of the kingdom all belonged to divine harmony. Children learned that maintaining order mattered. Obedience mattered. Proper behavior mattered. And so social expectations gained spiritual meaning as well. Even ordinary labor could feel connected to sacred balance. A farmer tending fields supported the kingdom. A scribe recording taxes supported order. A mother preparing bread supported family stability. Children grew up hearing these ideas repeated gently throughout life. Over time, duty became something larger than personal desire. At times, festivals briefly softened the harshness of ordinary routines. Temple celebrations filled cities with music, incense, food, and colored cloth fluttering in the warm breeze. Crowds gathered beside decorated streets while priests carried sacred statues hidden beneath embroidered coverings. Children loved these days. They watched dancers move beside torchlight. They tasted sweet cakes flavored with dates and honey. They listened to drums echo through crowded neighborhoods after sunset. For a little while, labor paused. Families laughed more easily. The city itself seemed lighter. But festivals ended quickly. Morning always returned. And with it came the familiar rhythm of work beginning once more before sunrise. In homes across Egypt, children slept beside worries they barely understood completely. Parents feared poor harvests, illness, debt, injury, officials collecting taxes, the uncertainty of the Nile itself. Children absorbed these fears quietly over time simply by living close to adult life. A child might notice tension in whispered conversations after dark. He might hear adults discussing low grain stores or damaged irrigation canals while pretending to sleep nearby. No one intentionally burdened children with anxiety. Yet anxiety filled the ancient world naturally because survival required constant effort. Even successful families remained vulnerable to sudden hardship. A single illness could weaken an entire household. A failed harvest season could create hunger lasting many months. And so adults pushed children toward readiness early because delay felt dangerous. The body itself became central to survival in ways difficult to separate from identity. Strong hands mattered. Healthy backs mattered. Endurance mattered. Children learned this through observation more than instruction. They watched workers limp home after injuries. They watched elderly laborers move slowly through the streets with bodies worn down by decades beneath the sun. They understood, even without words, that life demanded physical sacrifice from nearly everyone. At sunset, the harsh brightness over Egypt slowly softened again. The Nile reflected orange and gold beneath the fading light. Boats drifted quietly toward shore while birds crossed the sky in dark moving shapes. Children returning home from workshops or fields often walked in silence during this hour. Too exhausted for much conversation. Dust covered their sandals. Their shoulders ached. Their eyes felt heavy long before night fully arrived. Yet evenings still brought moments of tenderness. Families gathered around shared meals beneath open courtyards where cooler air finally began moving through the homes. Someone tore fresh bread into smaller pieces. Someone poured water carefully into clay cups cooled by evaporation. Children leaned against parents or older siblings while listening to quiet conversations drifting through the lamplight. Stories were told softly then. Stories about old kings. About the gods guiding the Nile. About ancestors remembered through fading generations. The flickering oil lamps cast warm shadows against mud brick walls while insects sang quietly beyond the courtyard. For a little while, the world felt safe. Not easy. Not free from hardship. But safe enough to rest. One by one, children drifted toward sleep beneath the warm Egyptian night. Outside, the river continued its endless journey through darkness. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another dawn already waited patiently for them all. In the deepest part of the night, when the air finally cooled enough for tired bodies to rest comfortably, the villages along the Nile became almost completely silent. The ovens had gone dark. The markets stood empty. The final voices from nearby courtyards faded softly into the warm darkness. Only the river continued moving. It slipped quietly past fields, temples, docks, and sleeping homes as it had done for thousands of years before these children were born, and as it would continue long after their names disappeared into history. Moonlight rested gently across the water. Palm trees swayed slowly in the night breeze. Somewhere far away, a small fishing boat drifted silently beneath the stars. Inside one modest mud brick home near the edge of a farming village, a boy slept beside his brothers on a woven mat spread across the floor. Their feet were dusty even after washing. Fine cracks marked their heels from walking long distances through dry fields and rough roads. The room smelled faintly of smoke and baked grain. Nearby, their parents slept lightly after another exhausting day of labor beneath the sun. Tomorrow would begin early again. It always did. For many children in ancient Egypt, life followed such steady repetition that years passed almost unnoticed. The same routines returned with the seasons until the boundaries between childhood and adulthood slowly disappeared. One year a boy carried small baskets beside his father. A few years later he carried full harvest loads alone. One year a girl watched her mother weave cloth beside the courtyard wall. Soon afterward she sat at the loom herself while younger siblings played nearby. Responsibility arrived quietly. Without ceremony. Without pause. And because everyone around them lived the same way, few children imagined life differently. Before dawn, the eastern sky slowly brightened beyond the riverbanks. Cool air drifted through open windows and across sleeping rooftops where some families rested during the hotter months. Children stirred slowly beneath linen coverings. A mother rose first. Then an older sister. Then one child after another. The city and the countryside awakened together. A grinding stone scraped softly inside one home while, farther away, fishermen untied boats from wooden posts beside the Nile. Donkeys shifted beneath heavy baskets already packed for the market. Bakers uncovered glowing coals inside ovens that still held warmth from the previous evening. The smells of morning spread gradually through the streets. Fresh dough. Smoke. Wet river mud. Palm leaves damp with dew. And beneath it all rested the familiar scent of dust warming beneath the coming sun. In workshops throughout the cities, apprentices began work before the heat became overwhelming. A young boy entering a carpenter's workshop might first sweep away sawdust gathered beneath wooden benches from yesterday's labor. He moved quietly while older craftsmen inspected tools arranged carefully along the walls. The workshop smelled warm and dry. Fresh cut cedar. Polished wood. Oil rubbed into handles worn smooth from years of use. Sunlight entered through narrow openings high above, casting pale golden shapes across the floor. Children working there learned patience through repetition. Again and again they practiced simple tasks. Measuring wood. Carrying supplies. Sharpening tools. Watching carefully. Older craftsmen rarely wasted words. Instruction often came through observation rather than explanation. A child learned by doing. And by failing. Mistakes brought frustration because materials were costly and time mattered. Yet over years, small uncertain movements slowly became skilled ones. The same quiet process unfolded in nearly every trade across Egypt. Children apprenticed to metal workers learned how heat changed copper and bronze inside smoky workshops where furnaces glowed orange beneath the dim light. Sweat rolled down their faces while sparks floated briefly through the air before disappearing into darkness. Children working with jewelers learned precision so delicate that even breathing too heavily could disturb fine work. Children training beside scribes copied symbols until their hands cramped from holding reed pens hour after hour. No path felt easy. Only necessary. In wealthier districts near the great temples, noble children also rose early each morning beneath expectation carefully woven into every part of daily life. Inside spacious homes with painted walls and shaded gardens, servants prepared water for washing while tutors arranged writing materials for morning lessons. A noble boy sat beside low tables covered with papyrus scrolls and practiced formal writing beneath the calm watch of his instructor. Outside, fountain water trickled softly into shallow pools while palm shadows moved across courtyard stones. The setting felt peaceful. Yet pressure remained constant. Every lesson prepared him for future responsibilities within the administration, the temples, or the royal court. He learned history, mathematics, religion, and etiquette not for curiosity alone, but because society expected competence from him. Failure would dishonor the family. And so even comfort carried weight. Young noble girls lived within similar expectations. Their days included music, weaving, household organization, ceremonial customs, and preparation for future marriages that would strengthen family alliances. They learned how to host guests properly, how to supervise servants, how to maintain dignity during public rituals. Even their posture and speech received careful attention from older women guiding them through elite social life. The ancient world believed preparation created stability. Children therefore became projects shaped carefully toward future usefulness. By late morning, the heat over Egypt intensified steadily. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads while sunlight reflected painfully from pale stone walls and dusty roads. In the fields, laborers bent low beside irrigation canals while insects hovered over standing water. Children working outdoors felt exhaustion building quickly beneath the harsh sky. A young shepherd guiding goats along dry paths outside the village wiped sweat from his eyes while watching carefully for wandering animals. Nearby, another child carried water from the river using clay jars that rubbed painfully against thin shoulders during long walks beneath the sun. No task felt light after several hours in the heat. Still, stopping too long invited criticism. Adults believed endurance mattered deeply because survival itself depended upon consistency. The crops would not wait. The animals would not wait. The ovens would not wait. And so children learned to continue working even when tiredness settled heavily into their bones. In many homes, midday meals remained simple and repetitive. Bread, beans, lentils, sometimes onions or dried fish, sometimes figs or dates during better seasons. Families often ate quickly before returning to work. Children rested briefly against cool interior walls while flies buzzed lazily through the warm still air. These quiet midday pauses sometimes became the calmest moments of the day. Outside, the street slowed beneath the intense heat. Even animals searched for shade. Temple stones radiated warmth like ovens beneath the sun. A child sitting silently during this hour might feel sleep pulling gently at tired eyes. But true rest remained rare. Soon another task arrived. Another responsibility waiting nearby. Along the Nile, children often developed a deep closeness with the river itself despite the labor connected to it. They learned its smells, its sounds, its moods during different seasons. They knew how the water looked before flooding began. How reeds sounded in strong wind. How fishing nets felt when heavy with catch. The river shaped their understanding of life from the beginning. Some children even learned to swim young despite the dangers. In shallow calmer areas near the banks, boys splashed quietly after work while the evening light softened across the water. For a few brief moments, childhood returned there. Laughter echoed across the riverbank. Water cooled tired skin. The heavy routines of the day drifted farther away. Yet eventually parents called them home. The evening meal waited. Tomorrow's labor waited too. As sunset approached, Egypt transformed slowly beneath gentler light. The harsh brightness faded from the fields and city streets. Palm trees cast long shadows over irrigation canals while birds crossed the glowing sky in scattered formations. Workers returned home with slower footsteps. Children walked quietly beside them carrying tools, baskets, or bundles gathered throughout the day. Dust coated their legs and sandals. Sweat dried against their skin. Many felt too exhausted even for conversation. Yet evening carried comforts unavailable during daylight hours. Families gathered together once more beneath open courtyards where breezes finally moved through the homes. Oil lamps flickered softly beside clay walls painted warm gold by firelight. Mothers prepared bread while older children helped serve food onto low tables. Fathers repaired tools or spoke quietly with neighbors nearby. The atmosphere softened. Someone laughed gently. Someone sang while rocking a tired child toward sleep. A flute played faintly from another courtyard farther down the street. Children listened while leaning against family members whose bodies also carried the weariness of the day. These moments of closeness mattered deeply because life outside them demanded so much. Sometimes grandparents shared stories during the evening meal. They spoke about earlier floods, old rulers, unusual storms, or memories from distant years now fading slowly with age. Children listened carefully while oil lamps flickered across ancient faces lined by decades of sun and labor. History passed through spoken memory long before it was written down. And children absorbed that history while resting between exhaustion and sleep. Illness remained present even during peaceful evenings. A coughing child resting in the corner reminded everyone how fragile life could become. Families worried quietly over fevers, infections, or injuries because medical knowledge remained limited despite the skills of Egyptian healers. A simple wound could grow dangerous. Bad water could spread sickness through entire households. And when illness arrived, children often continued working as long as possible before weakness forced them to stop. Rest was valuable. But survival usually mattered more. At night, rooftops filled with sleeping families seeking cooler air beneath the stars. Children lay beside parents and siblings while warm desert winds moved gently across the city. Above them stretched an enormous sky crowded with stars brighter than anything most modern eyes would ever see. Priests studied those stars carefully. Farmers watched them too. Children learned their patterns naturally after years spent sleeping beneath open skies. A boy lying awake beside the Nile might hear water touching softly against reeds in the darkness. He might smell distant cooking fires finally fading into ash. The world felt quieter then. Softer. For a little while, childhood itself almost seemed peaceful again. But beyond the eastern horizon, another dawn already waited patiently. And with it would come the familiar rhythm of work, expectation, and endurance beginning once more beside the ancient river. The final hours before dawn often felt the most peaceful in all of ancient Egypt. The heat softened. The winds cooled slightly as they crossed the dark surface of the Nile. Even the restless sounds of the cities faded into stillness for a little while. Children sleeping on rooftops beneath the stars sometimes opened their eyes briefly during this quiet hour. They saw the moon hanging low above distant temple walls. They heard reeds whispering near the riverbanks far below. Then sleep returned again. Their bodies needed it deeply. Day after day, exhaustion gathered slowly inside growing bones and tired muscles. Ancient childhood rarely moved gently. Even happiness often existed beside fatigue. And soon enough, morning always returned. Across Egypt, darkness slowly lifted from the land. The eastern horizon became pale blue first, then soft gold spread across the river water while birds circled above the fields searching for food among the reeds. In the villages, smoke rose from the first cooking fires. Inside crowded homes, mothers and older daughters woke before nearly everyone else. They prepared grain for grinding while younger children still slept beside the fading coolness of night. Grinding grain remained one of the most constant sounds in Egyptian life. Stone pressed against stone. Again. 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 The rhythm echoed through homes every morning across the Nile Valley. Young girls learned this labor early because bread stood at the center of nearly every meal. Their hands toughened over time. Their shoulders strengthened from repetition. And slowly, their childhood became tied to endless routines that adults barely noticed anymore because they themselves had grown up the same way. In wealthier homes, servants performed much of this difficult work. Yet even there, children woke early beneath structured routines shaped by expectation and discipline. A noble boy might begin the day with lessons before sunrise while cool air still moved through shaded courtyards filled with palm trees and shallow pools of water. His tutor waited patiently beside low wooden tables covered with papyrus scrolls. The boy copied symbols carefully. Rows of formal writing. Lists of grain measurements. Religious hymns. Administrative records. Outside, servants swept the courtyards while birds called softly from the garden walls. Everything appeared calm. Yet even this calmness carried pressure. Every lesson prepared him for adult responsibility. Every mistake mattered. Children throughout Egyptian society understood something very early in life. The future was always approaching. And adults were always preparing them for it. Along the Nile River, fishermen pushed boats away from shore while the sky slowly brightened overhead. Young boys climbed aboard carrying nets still damp from the previous day. The wood beneath their feet smelled of water, fish, and old river mud baked dry by countless afternoons beneath the sun. Morning air felt cool against their skin. But they knew it would not last. Soon the heat would return once more. The river itself looked beautiful at sunrise. Soft light shimmered across gentle waves while mist hovered low above the water. Birds skimmed the surface searching for fish. Palm shadows stretched long across the banks. For a moment, the world seemed quiet enough for rest. Then the labor began. Nets dropped into the water. Ropes tightened. Voices called softly across the boats. Children worked beside adults because every catch mattered to the survival of the household. Fish would feed the family. Extra fish might be traded in the market. Nothing could be wasted. Farther inland, farming communities awakened beneath the growing sunlight. Workers crossed narrow paths between irrigation canals carrying tools over their shoulders while oxen moved slowly through the fields ahead of them. Children followed behind. A young boy might spend hours scaring birds away from newly planted grain by waving cloth strips tied to sticks. Another guided animals through muddy water while insects gathered around his legs beneath the warming air. The work appeared simple from a distance. But repetition wore the body down slowly. The sun climbed higher. Sweat gathered across faces and backs. Mud dried hard against the skin. Still the labor continued. Children learned endurance because everyone around them endured the same conditions. No one expected comfort from life beside the Nile. Only survival. Only stability. Only enough grain stored safely for the next season. In the cities, apprentices filled workshops before the streets became crowded with midday traffic. The sounds of labor slowly spread through the neighborhoods. Hammering. Sawing. Grinding. Pottery wheels turning steadily. Voices calling between market stalls. The cities never fully rested. A young apprentice potter carried wet clay from storage pits while older craftsmen shaped jars with calm practiced hands. The workshop smelled earthy and damp despite the growing heat outside. Nearby, another child learning metalwork pumped air into a furnace while sparks drifted upward into the smoky darkness above. Many children spent more time beside craftsmen than beside their own parents during the day. Their trades became their education. Their workplaces became part of childhood itself. Even simple movements carried lessons. How to lift properly. How to sharpen tools. How to judge materials by touch alone. Adults rarely explained everything directly. Children learned by watching carefully and repeating tasks until their bodies remembered naturally. Mistakes brought frustration, sometimes punishment. But improvement brought quiet approval that felt deeply meaningful. A skilled worker survived more safely in the ancient world. Children understood that even if no one spoke the words aloud. Near the great temples, scribal schools filled with boys seated cross-legged on reed mats while teachers recited lessons from memory. Warm sunlight filtered through narrow windows high above the room. The children bent over writing boards while sweat slowly formed beneath the collars of their linen clothing. Hours passed quietly. The scratching sound of reed pens filled the air. Some students dreamed of becoming respected officials who worked in cool administrative halls rather than under the burning sun. Others simply feared failing their families. Education offered opportunity. But it also carried heavy pressure. A child who struggled with writing might hear constant reminders about the hardships awaiting ordinary laborers. Teachers described the suffering of stonecutters, farmers, and soldiers with careful detail meant to encourage discipline. Study harder. Write more carefully. Do not waste your chance. And so childhood itself became connected to performance, to usefulness, to proving one's value before adulthood even arrived. Girls in ordinary households carried equally demanding expectations, though their work often remained less visible in historical records. Inside homes throughout Egypt, girls spent long days preparing food, weaving cloth, carrying water, washing linen, caring for younger children, and maintaining household order. These tasks rarely ended. One chore flowed directly into another. A girl who finished grinding grain still needed to prepare bread. After bread came cleaning. After cleaning came weaving or sewing. After that came collecting water again before evening. The routines formed an endless circle repeated day after day beneath the changing seasons. Yet within these routines, moments of tenderness still appeared quietly. A mother teaching her daughter how to braid linen thread properly. Sisters laughing softly together while carrying water jars toward the river. Grandmothers humming old songs while preparing meals beside the evening fire. Childhood had not disappeared completely. It simply existed within labor rather than apart from it. By midday, the heat over Egypt became heavy enough to slow nearly every movement. The streets shimmered beneath sunlight. Workers searched desperately for shade. Dogs slept beneath carts while flies gathered thickly around market refuse left baking beside the roads. Children felt the exhaustion deeply then. A servant boy carrying messages between homes might pause beside a cool stone wall while trying to catch his breath. Nearby, a young girl tending younger siblings fanned them gently while sweat rolled down her face into the dust below. The air itself felt difficult to move through. Yet stopping completely remained impossible. Meals needed preparing. Animals needed feeding. Customers waited in the market. Officials expected records completed before sunset. And children remained part of this endless movement surrounding the Nile. During flood season, life changed shape but never truly became easier. Water spread across fields while villages adjusted to temporary shorelines and flooded roads. Children often traveled by boat during these months. They learned to balance carefully while stepping between narrow wooden vessels tied along muddy banks. The floodwaters carried both danger and hope. Good flooding meant fertile soil and successful harvests later. Poor flooding meant hunger. Families watched the river closely each year because so much depended upon its behavior. Children absorbed this anxiety naturally from the adults around them. Even young boys understood when fathers spoke quietly about low water levels. Even young girls noticed tension in the household when crops appeared weak. The Nile shaped not only the land itself, but the emotional life of Egypt too. As evening finally approached, relief spread slowly across the cities and villages. The sun lowered toward the western desert hills. Shadows lengthened across temple walls and canals. Warm orange light reflected across the river while boats drifted calmly back toward shore. Children returning home after long days of labor often looked completely exhausted by this hour. Dust covered their legs. Their hands felt sore. Their eyes struggled to stay open during the final tasks before rest. Yet evening also carried beauty difficult to describe fully. Cooking smells filled the streets. Fresh bread, lentils, roasting fish. The sounds of families gathering together drifted through open courtyards while oil lamps flickered softly against mud brick walls. For a little while, the world slowed again. Adults spoke quietly about ordinary things. Repairs needed tomorrow. News from nearby villages. The coming flood season. A marriage being arranged. Children listened while leaning against tired parents whose own bodies carried years of labor beneath the Egyptian sun. Sometimes musicians played softly in distant courtyards. A flute. A small drum. A voice singing gently into the warm night air. These sounds floated across rooftops beneath the first appearing stars. And slowly, ancient Egypt drifted once more toward sleep. Children lay down beside siblings and parents while breezes moved softly through the darkness carrying the scent of river water and cooling earth. Their bodies ached from work. Their minds already carried thoughts of tomorrow's responsibilities. Yet for a few quiet hours beneath the endless stars above the Nile, they rested. As the night deepened over Egypt, the great river moved quietly beneath the stars, carrying moonlight across its slow dark surface. The Nile never hurried. It flowed patiently past sleeping villages, silent temples, crowded cities, and endless fields resting beneath the warm darkness. Palm trees leaned softly in the night wind while reeds whispered along the muddy banks. Inside small homes built from sun-dried brick, children slept close beside their families. Some dreamed lightly. Some slept with the heavy stillness of complete exhaustion. The air inside the homes remained warm even long after sunset. Thin linen cloth covered tired bodies while faint sounds drifted through open windows from distant courtyards and quiet streets. A donkey shifted somewhere nearby. A baby cried briefly before falling silent again. Then there was only the river. In ancient Egypt, life repeated itself so steadily that days often blended together like flowing water. One morning resembled the next. One season slowly followed another. And for children, that repetition shaped the entire experience of growing up. There were no long years protected from adult worries. No separate world made only for childhood. Instead, children lived close to labor from the very beginning. They watched it. They joined it. And slowly they became part of it completely. Before dawn, while the sky still carried traces of starlight, workers across Egypt began waking once more. Cooking fires glowed softly inside homes while smoke drifted upward through roof openings into the cool early air. Children stirred beneath blankets spread across reed mats. The body often resisted waking. Muscles still ached from the previous day. Hands remained sore. Eyes felt heavy. But the routines waiting outside allowed little delay. In farming villages beside the Nile, boys walked quietly behind fathers toward the fields while the horizon slowly brightened. The earth still felt cool beneath bare feet during these early hours. Frogs moved through irrigation channels. Birds called from marsh grasses near the water. For a short while, before sunrise fully arrived, the world carried a calm beauty that softened even the hardest labor. Children noticed these moments. The pale mist over the river. the gentle movement of reeds in the wind, the sound of water flowing through narrow canals. But beauty did not remove exhaustion. Soon tools were lifted, animals guided into place, seeds scattered into wet soil, and another day of work unfolded beneath the rising sun. Young girls in the villages often remained closer to the household, yet their days were no less demanding. Long before daylight fully entered the home, grinding stones already scraped steadily against grain. The sound repeated endlessly across Egypt each morning. Stone against stone. Slow. Heavy. Rhythmic. Girls learned to move their hands in careful patterns while flour dust settled across their skin and hair. Nearby, mothers prepared dough for bread while younger children still slept curled together against the walls. The home itself felt alive with labor from the earliest hour. Water needed carrying. Cooking fires needed tending. Clothing needed washing. Animals needed feeding. Children absorbed these routines so naturally that many could barely remember a time before responsibility. Even games sometimes copied the adult world surrounding them. Children shaped tiny boats from reeds and floated them through shallow water beside irrigation canals. They pretended to trade goods in miniature markets built from stones and scraps of wood. The adult world remained closed at all times. Its expectations surrounded childhood completely. Inside the larger cities, morning arrived with noise and movement spreading through the streets like a tide. Merchants opened market stalls beneath woven awnings. Bakers carried fresh bread from hot ovens while smoke curled upward into the brightening sky. Donkeys loaded with baskets pushed through narrow roads already crowded with workers heading toward temples, workshops, and docks. Children moved among them constantly. A servant boy hurried through the streets balancing clay jars filled with water. A young apprentice opened the shutters of a carpenter's workshop while sweeping dust from the floor before the master craftsman arrived. A girl carried folded linen to the market beside her mother while trying to avoid stepping into muddy patches left by animals along the road. The city demanded constant movement. And children became part of that movement early in life. In scribal schools attached to temples and government buildings, boys sat cross-legged on reed mats while teachers dictated lessons in calm, serious voices. Warm sunlight entered through narrow windows. The room smelled faintly of ink, papyrus, sweat, and dust. Students copied symbols carefully onto wooden writing boards while trying not to make mistakes that would invite criticism. Education carried prestige in Egypt. A successful scribe could avoid much of the physical suffering faced by laborers in the fields and workshops. Parents knew this. Teachers repeated it constantly. So children studied with great seriousness despite exhaustion or boredom. The lessons often continued for many hours without interruption. A boy's hand cramped from holding the reed pen. His back ached from sitting still. His eyelids grew heavy beneath the warm afternoon air. Yet the writing continued. Again and again. Because childhood had become preparation. A test of discipline. A measure of future survival. Girls in wealthier homes also received careful instruction, though in different forms. Noble daughters learned music, weaving, religious customs, household management, and social behavior expected among elite families. Servants carried out much of the hardest labor around them, yet these girls still lived beneath constant expectation. They were taught how to move gracefully through formal gatherings. How to oversee household workers. How to prepare offerings at family shrines. How to represent their families with dignity and restraint. Everything pointed toward the future. Everything prepared them for adult responsibility long before adulthood arrived. Outside the wealthier districts, ordinary children carried more visible burdens. By midday, the heat over Egypt pressed down with enormous force. Stone walls reflected sunlight into the streets while dry winds carried fine dust through the air. Children working outdoors felt exhaustion settle deeply into their bodies during these hours. A young laborer hauling clay for brick-making wiped sweat from his face while his feet burned against the ground beneath him. Nearby, another child helped stack drying bricks beneath the open sky while flies circled lazily overhead. The work felt endless. Lift. Carry. Stack. Repeat. The rhythm itself became hypnotic beneath the heat. Children learned not to complain because nearly every adult around them carried the same exhaustion. Suffering was ordinary. Quiet endurance was admired. Even in homes where love and tenderness existed deeply, parents often pushed children toward discipline because the world itself felt uncertain and demanding. Illness could destroy stability quickly. A failed harvest could bring hunger. Injury could leave a family without enough labor to survive. So preparation became an act of protection. At least that was how many adults understood it. Along the Nile docks, children helping merchants and fishermen moved through crowded spaces filled with noise and strong smells. Fish scales shimmered beneath the sun. Boats knocked gently together against wooden piers. Men shouted prices across the marketplace while porters carried sacks of grain balanced against their shoulders. Young boys unloaded baskets from boats or cleaned fish beside the water. Their hands smelled constantly of river mud and scales. Some dreamed quietly of owning their own boats someday. Others simply worked because their families depended upon every small coin earned. Childhood dreams existed, but necessity often stood closer. During the hottest part of the afternoon, much of Egypt slowed beneath the weight of the sun. Workers rested briefly wherever shade could be found. Temple walls provided cool shadows. Market awnings trapped small pockets of relief. Inside homes, families sat quietly while warm air drifted slowly through open windows. Children rested too, though often only for a short while. A boy might fall asleep briefly against a wall before being woken for another errand. A girl tending younger siblings might close her eyes for only a few moments while the babies slept nearby. True rest remained rare. There was always another task waiting. Another responsibility close behind the last. As evening approached, however, the world softened beautifully. The fierce brightness faded from the fields and rooftops. The Nile reflected gold and deep orange beneath the lowering sun. Palm trees cast long shadows across dusty roads where workers slowly returned home. Children walked more slowly then. The day sat heavily upon them. Dust coated their ankles. Sweat dried against their skin. Their shoulders sagged beneath tools and baskets carried home from workshops and fields. Yet evening still brought comfort. Cooking fires glowed warmly inside courtyards. Families gathered together once more after the long exhausting hours of labor. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Sometimes fish cooked over open flames. Sometimes lentils simmered slowly in clay pots while insects hummed beyond the courtyard walls. Children sat close beside parents during the evening meal. Adults spoke quietly about ordinary worries. Taxes. Flood levels. Repairs needed before next season. Relatives becoming ill. The cost of grain in the market. Children listened while eating hungrily in the flickering lamplight. These conversations shaped them deeply because they revealed how fragile stability could become. Even successful families worried constantly about the future. Still, moments of peace appear gently within the hardship. A father lifting a sleepy child after dinner. A mother smoothing dust from her daughter's hair. Brothers laughing quietly together before sleep. Someone singing softly while oil lamps flickered against the walls. The ancient world was difficult. But it was also deeply human. At night, rooftops filled with sleeping families seeking cooler air beneath the open sky. Children lay beside parents while warm breezes moved softly through the darkness carrying the scent of river water and distant reeds. Above them stretched countless stars bright enough to reflect faintly upon the Nile itself. A child lying awake during these quiet hours might feel the world slowing at last. No tools needed lifting now. No lessons waited beside the lamplight. No overseer called out instructions. Only the soft movement of wind. The distant sound of water touching the shore. And the steady breathing of exhausted families finally at rest beside the ancient river. Far out beyond the sleeping villages and darkened temple walls, the desert rested beneath a sky filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The sand still held traces of the day's heat. Warm wind moved slowly across the empty land, carrying fine dust toward the Nile where Egypt stretched like a long green ribbon through the darkness. Beside the river, families slept in silence. Some rested inside crowded homes where the air remained thick and warm even at night. Others slept on rooftops beneath the open sky, hoping for cooler breezes drifting from the water. Children slept deeply after long days of labor. Their small hands, roughened by work, rested beside tired faces. Their breathing rose and fell slowly beneath the stars. For a little while, there were no expectations. No chores waiting. No teachers correcting mistakes. Only rest. Yet morning always returned. Before sunrise, Egypt slowly awakened once more beneath pale blue light spreading across the eastern horizon. The river reflected the first traces of dawn while reeds along the shore moved gently in the early wind. The sounds of waking life began quietly. A door opening. Sandals scraping stone floors. A grinding stone turning against grain. The soft cough of someone still tired from yesterday's labor. Children opened heavy eyes while darkness still lingered inside the rooms. Many woke already exhausted because their bodies had not fully recovered from the previous day. Still, there was no choice except to rise. The ovens needed lighting. The water jars needed filling. The fields waited. In one small farming village south of Thebes, a young boy stepped outside with his father before the sun had fully risen. The air smelled cool and damp beside the irrigation canals. For a few moments, the world felt peaceful. Mist drifted low over the fields. Birds moved through tall reeds near the riverbank. The mud beneath their feet felt soft from the night's cooler air. Then the work began. The boy carried a wooden tool almost as long as his arm while his father inspected the water channels feeding the crops. Both moved quietly through the pale morning light. There was no need for many words. The routine had repeated itself too many times already. Children learned these routines through constant repetition. No formal lessons were needed. They watched, copied, and slowly absorbed the knowledge surrounding them. How deep water should flow through a canal. How grain should feel when ready for harvest. How to repair broken tools using scraps of wood and rope. The land itself became their teacher. And childhood became preparation for survival beside that land. Nearby, girls in the village already worked beside cooking fires while smoke drifted softly into the brightening sky. One young girl knelt beside a grinding stone, moving her hands steadily back and forth while flour gathered beneath the heavy stone wheel. The sound echoed softly through the home. Stone against grain. Slow and constant. Her younger brother still slept nearby curled beneath a linen cloth while their mother prepared dough in the warm firelight. Soon bread would bake inside the clay oven. Soon water would need carrying from the river. Soon younger children would wake needing care. The day unfolded task by task before it had fully begun. In ancient Egypt, labor shaped time itself. Morning belonged to preparation. Midday belonged to endurance. Evening belonged to recovery. And then the cycle repeated again. Inside larger cities, the streets slowly filled with movement beneath the growing sunlight. Merchants uncovered goods displayed carefully beside market stalls. Bakers arranged fresh bread in woven baskets while the smell of warm grain drifted through narrow roads already crowded with people. Children moved through these streets constantly. A servant girl balanced jars of beer and water against her hips while weaving carefully between animals and laborers. An apprentice metal worker hurried toward the furnace workshop before the heat inside became unbearable. The city sounded alive from the earliest hour. Voices calling. Donkeys braying. Wooden wheels scraping stone roads. Boatmen shouting from the river docks. And beneath it all, the steady hum of thousands of ordinary lives moving through familiar routines. Many children spent more time working than resting. Their bodies adapted slowly to long hours beneath difficult conditions. Feet hardened from walking barefoot across rough ground. Hands became calloused from tools, rope, clay, or weaving thread. Childhood left physical marks upon them early. A young boy helping stonecutters near temple construction sites often carried water jars or gathered scattered tools beneath the burning sun. White limestone dust covered his skin and clothing by midday. The air around the work site rang with the sound of hammering echoing against unfinished walls. The work felt enormous. Temple columns towered overhead. Massive statues rested half-carved beside the roads. Children standing among such places must have felt very small. Yet their labor still mattered. Every worker mattered. Even the youngest. Inside pottery workshops, apprentices worked beside spinning wheels while older craftsmen shaped clay with practiced movements that looked almost effortless. The room smelled of wet earth and smoke from nearby kilns where finished vessels baked beneath intense heat. Children watched carefully. They learned how much pressure fingers should use against spinning clay. How quickly mistakes ruined a vessel. How patience mattered more than speed. Many spent years performing only simple tasks before touching important work themselves. This slow training shaped their understanding of life. Skill came through endurance. Respect came through discipline. And childhood slowly disappeared beneath preparation for adulthood. In schools attached to temples, young scribes bent over writing boards while teachers moved quietly among them correcting errors. The students copied lists of symbols, religious texts, legal records, and mathematical exercises used for measuring crops and collecting taxes. The room felt warm even during morning hours. Flies drifted lazily through beams of sunlight entering from narrow windows high above. Children rubbed sore hands while continuing to write. Many feared failure deeply because education offered one of the few paths away from the hardest physical labor. Their families sacrificed greatly for these opportunities. A successful scribe might someday work in shaded administrative halls rather than beneath the open sun. But reaching that future required years of discipline beginning in childhood. And so even learning became exhausting. Teachers believed hardship created strength. Parents often agreed. A child who endured difficult lessons now might survive adult responsibilities more successfully later. This belief existed across every level of Egyptian society. Preparation mattered more than comfort. Usefulness mattered more than freedom. Along the Nile itself, children helping fishing families experienced a life shaped completely by water and weather. The river determined everything. Good catches brought stability. Poor catches brought worry. Young boys rose before dawn to untangle nets still damp from the previous day while older fishermen repaired wooden boats nearby. The smell of fish and river mud clung to everything. Wet rope. Wooden docks. Clothing drying in the sun. Children learned balance early because boats shifted constantly beneath their feet. They learned currents, river depths, weather patterns, and the behavior of fish long before adulthood arrived. The Nile became part of their memory itself. At times, children still found moments of play beside the riverbanks. They skipped stones across shallow water. They splashed one another during brief pauses after work. They floated tiny reed boats through irrigation channels while laughing softly together. But even these moments existed within the shadow of responsibility. Soon enough someone called them back to work. By midday, the heat across Egypt became crushing. The sky above the desert turned pale and harsh beneath the sun. Stone walls radiated warmth into narrow city streets while workers searched desperately for shade. Children often looked exhausted by this hour. A young servant carrying water jars paused briefly beside a temple wall while sweat rolled down his neck into the dust below. Nearby, girls weaving linen inside crowded homes wiped tired eyes while their fingers continued moving automatically through practiced motions. The air barely moved. Breathing itself felt heavy. Still, life continued. Bread needed baking. Fields needed watering. Animals needed feeding. Records needed writing. The ancient world offered little opportunity to stop completely. Even illness rarely allowed full rest. Children often worked while sick unless weakness became impossible to ignore. Fevers spread through crowded homes during the hottest seasons. Coughs lingered for weeks. Infections caused by dirty water or insects weakened entire families. Parents worried constantly. A sick child threatened emotional pain, but also practical hardship for the household. Who would carry water? Who would help in the fields? Who would care for younger siblings? Survival depended upon many small tasks completed every day. And children formed part of that fragile system. As evening finally approached, the fierce brightness over Egypt softened into gold and deep orange light. Workers returned slowly through dusty streets carrying tools and baskets worn smooth from years of use. Children walked beside them with tired eyes and aching shoulders. Yet evening brought relief too. Cooking smells drifted through the neighborhoods. Fresh bread. Onions roasting over small fires. Fish cooking beside the river. Families gathered together in courtyards while warm winds moved gently through the homes. Oil lamps flickered softly against mud brick walls darkened by years of smoke. Children listened quietly while adults discussed ordinary worries. Flood levels. Taxes. Repairs needed before harvest. Rumors from nearby towns. The conversations blended with the sounds of insects singing beyond the walls and distant music drifting through the streets. Sometimes someone played a flute softly in the darkness. Sometimes old stories were told beside the evening meal while younger children slowly fell asleep against their parents. These peaceful moments mattered because they reminded families that life contained tenderness alongside hardship. The ancient world demanded much from children. But families still loved them deeply. A mother brushed dust from her son's hair before sleep. A father carried a sleeping daughter onto the rooftop beneath the stars. An older sister covered younger siblings with linen cloth after the night air cooled slightly. Quiet acts of care filled the spaces between labor and exhaustion. And above them all, the Nile continued flowing through the darkness, carrying another ancient night gently toward dawn. The night over Egypt deepened once again, not suddenly, but slowly, like ink spreading across the sky. One moment the river still held a faint memory of sunset, a thin line of gold resting on its surface. Then even that faded, leaving only the soft movement of water beneath endless stars. The Nile did not rush. It never had. It moved with the same patience it had carried for generations beyond counting, long before any child sleeping beside its banks had ever opened their eyes for the first time. In small homes scattered along the river, children slept in quiet exhaustion. Some lay curled together on woven mats, their bodies still warm from the day's labor. Others slept on rooftops where the night air moved more freely, where the heat of stone walls slowly softened under the open sky. A gentle wind passed through palm trees. Reeds along the water whispered faintly. Even sleep in ancient Egypt felt connected to the land itself, as if the rhythm of the river reached into dreams. But even in rest, the body remembered tomorrow. Before dawn, the first movement began again. A door opened softly in the dark. Bare feet touched cool stone floors. A clay jar was lifted carefully to avoid waking those still sleeping. Inside kitchens, embers were stirred back to life, glowing faintly beneath ash as smoke began to rise once more into the early air. The smell of fire returned. Bread would soon be needed. Water would soon be carried. The world would soon begin its familiar cycle again. Children woke slowly, not because they wished to, but because their bodies had learned the pattern of survival. Eyes opened in dim light. Hands reached for clothing still folded beside sleeping mats. The air felt cooler before sunrise, almost kind, as if the world briefly softened before demanding movement again. In farming villages, families stepped outside into the pre-dawn quiet. The fields lay still under a sky fading from black into deep blue. Mist drifted low across the soil, settling in soft layers between rows of crops and irrigation channels fed by the Nile. For a few moments, everything felt suspended. No voices. No tools striking stone. No shouting from markets or workshops. Only silence, and the faint sound of water moving through narrow canals. Then labor resumed. Children walked beside adults toward the fields with slow, familiar steps. The earth beneath them was damp and cool, softened by the night's air. Birds stirred in the distance, their calls still half asleep. A boy carried a wooden hoe nearly as tall as his shoulder. A girl followed with a woven basket resting against her hip. Their movements were quiet. Not rushed. Not joyful. Just practiced. In Egypt, work often began gently, as if the world itself needed time to remember its shape each morning. Soon the sun would rise fully, and that gentleness would fade. But for now, the river breeze still carried calm across the land. Farther downstream, fishing families prepared their boats in the half-light. Wood creaked softly as vessels were pushed into shallow water. Ropes were untied. Nets were checked carefully for damage from the previous day. Young boys stood barefoot at the edge of the riverbank, watching the water shift between darkness and reflection. They knew this river intimately. They knew where currents slowed near hidden sandbars. They knew where fish gathered in the early morning shadows. They knew how quickly weather could change along open water. Even childhood, here, was shaped by observation. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was ignored. In the cities, the first signs of movement spread through narrow streets. A baker pulled flat loaves from clay ovens while heat still lingered inside from the night before. A servant girl carried water through crowded alleyways, stepping carefully around sleeping animals and uneven stone. A young boy opened workshop doors while sweeping away dust that had settled during the night. The city seemed to wake in layers. First sound. Then motion. Then noise. Then full life. By the time the sun rose above the horizon, Egypt was already fully awake again. And children were already working. Inside workshops, apprentices resumed tasks that had never truly ended. A carpenter's child sorted wood pieces by size and grain. A metal worker's apprentice cleaned soot from tools still warm from yesterday's furnace. A potter's assistant prepared clay by mixing river mud with water until it reached the right softness. Each task required patience. Each mistake carried consequence. Materials were valuable. Time was precious. So children learned quickly that slow, careful work mattered more than speed. Outside, the heat began to grow again. Not immediately overwhelming, but steadily, like a presence returning to the land. By mid-morning, sunlight struck the city with full strength. Stone walls became warm to the touch. Dust rose from passing feet. Shadows shortened beneath doorways and market stalls. Children working outdoors felt it first. A young laborer carrying baskets of grain paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. Another, guiding animals through irrigation paths, stepped into muddy water that offered brief relief from the heat. In the fields, rows of crops shimmered under the rising sun. Workers bent low, their bodies moving in steady rhythm, repeating the same motions over and over again until the work demanded rest. Children mirrored these movements. Small bodies learning endurance through repetition. Not taught through words alone, but through participation. Always participation. Near temple sites, construction continued even under growing heat. Massive stones rested in place like silent giants. Workers pulled ropes while others guided blocks across wooden sledges. The sound of effort filled the air. Grunts. Wood creaking. Stone scraping against sand. Children moved among them carrying water skins or gathering dropped tools. Their presence was small beside the scale of the work, yet necessary all the same. No task was too small to matter. In scribal rooms, the rhythm of learning continued beneath shaded stone interiors. Reed pens scratched across writing surfaces in steady repetition. Teachers moved slowly between students, correcting posture, adjusting technique, pointing out errors with quiet firmness. The air inside these rooms felt slightly cooler than outside, but still heavy with concentration and fatigue. A child bent over writing might feel time stretching endlessly. Each symbol carefully copied. Each line measured. Each correction repeated. The goal was perfection through repetition. Not excitement. Not speed. Only accuracy. Outside these learning spaces, the world continued its louder rhythm. Markets filled again as the day advanced. Vendors called out prices. Donkeys pushed through crowds. Children ran errands between stalls carrying messages, goods, or small bundles of supplies. The city never stayed still for long. Even when tired, even when overheated, it moved forward. By midday, the land reached its most difficult point. The sun stood high and heavy above Egypt, turning the air still and bright. Heat pressed down on fields, rooftops, stone roads, and riverbanks alike. Animals rested in place. Workers slowed beneath any available shade. Children felt this hour deeply. A young girl resting inside a workshop leaned against a wall while her weaving frame stood untouched for a brief moment. A boy carrying tools across a construction site stopped beneath a stone overhang, breathing slowly while waiting for strength to return. Even the Nile seemed quieter at this time, its surface shimmering under intense light that reflected back into the sky. Yet even this pause did not last long. Work returned gradually as the sun shifted. Tasks resumed. Movements restarted. The rhythm of the day continued forward. As evening approached once more, Egypt softened again. Heat gave way to gentler air. Light turned golden, then amber, then deep orange across the horizon. Shadows stretched long across fields and city streets. The river reflected the sky like a mirror slowly dimming into night. Children returning home walked more slowly now. Fatigue sat heavily in their limbs. Dust clung to their clothing. Hands and feet carried the memory of every task completed that day. Yet evening always brought something gentler. A return. Not to rest alone, but to family. To shared meals. To small moments of quiet connection beneath flickering oil lamps. Inside courtyards, bread was broken and passed between tired hands. Soup simmered slowly in clay pots. Soft voices filled the space between walls. Sometimes laughter appeared briefly, light and unexpected, before fading into the calm again. Children leaned against parents or siblings while eating, their eyelids growing heavier with each passing moment. Outside, night gathered slowly once more over the Nile. Stars returned. The river darkened. The world grew quiet again. And sleep, familiar and constant, came gently back to every home along the ancient water. Night settles over Egypt the way it always does, without urgency, without sound that lingers too long. The river moves in the darkness, carrying reflections of stars that feel endless and patient. Along its banks, reeds bend softly in the wind, and the desert beyond the fields becomes a quiet shape that fades into shadow. Inside the small homes near the water, the final embers of cooking fires dim into faint red points before disappearing under ash. One by one, the sounds of the day are gone. No footsteps in the streets. No voices calling across the markets. No tools striking stone. Only the slow breath of the land, rising and falling in silence. Children sleep where they have always slept, close to family, close to warmth that remains even after fire has gone out. Their bodies rest deeply now, heavier than thought, heavier than memory, as if the earth itself is holding them gently in place. There is no rush in this moment. No task waiting at the edge of waking. Only stillness. The Nile continues its long journey through the night, as it has for longer than any story can remember. It moves past broken shadows of temples, past fields that will wake again in the morning, past villages that will rise and work and rest and rise again. And in that endless rhythm, childhood, labor, rest, and time itself all become part of the same quiet flow. Nothing is separate here. Everything belongs to the same slow life beside the river. Far away, the first hint of dawn begins to form, though no one yet sees it. It waits, patient and certain, beyond the horizon. But for now, there is only night. Only breathing. Only sleep. And the gentle presence of the ancient river holding the world in silence.